They say the destiny of nations is decided in gold-leafed halls and marble palaces, but they are wrong. The man who would eventually break the world and rebuild it in his own image was born in a room that smelled of dry earth, old wood, and the bitter scent of a lost cause. Long before he wore a crown of gold or commanded the grandest army the earth had ever seen, he wore only the shadow of a dying resistance. The world was blissfully unaware that a small rug in a quiet house in Ajaccio was the launching pad for a storm that would swallow an entire continent. The Mediterranean Sea does not just carry water, it carries the weight of empires yet to be born, and the salt-stained memories of civilizations that have long since crumbled into the cold abyss of history. In the heavy and suffocating heat of August 1769, the salt-cracked air of the island of Corsica held a static tension that the rest of the world had not yet learned to fear. It was a pungent mixture of wild maquis shrubs and the fading smoke of a fierce resistance that had refused to surrender even in the face of absolute annihilation. On this rugged and untamed island, where the granite mountains pierced the low-hanging clouds like the jagged teeth of a sleeping titan, a child was born onto a simple tapestry rug. There were no royal trumpets that heralded his arrival to the weary world, and no messengers rode out to announce the birth of a future king. Only the rhythmic and relentless crashing of the turquoise waves against the limestone cliffs of Ajaccio provided a lonely symphony for his very first breath. This was a land caught in a violent tug-of-war between two worlds, a jagged piece of rock that the Republic of Genoa had recently sold like a common commodity to the French crown to settle its mounting debts. The people of Corsica were not truly French, nor were they purely Italian. They were a breed of their own creation, forged by the relentless sun and the bitter isolation of the sea. In the dimly lit and narrow rooms of the Casa Buonaparte, the air was thick with the suffocating tension of a family that stood on the brink of social and financial ruin. Carlo Buonaparte and his wife Letizia did not yet know that the small boy they held in their arms was the single spark that would eventually set the entire continent of Europe ablaze from the Atlantic to the Urals. He was born into the long shadow of defeat, arriving just months after the French military had decisively crushed the Corsican dream of independence at the bloody Battle of Pont Novo. This context of constant struggle, of being an underdog in a world of giants, would become the very marrow of his bones and the engine of his terrifying ambition. The silence of the island in that era was deceptive and haunting. Beneath the surface of this quiet port town, a fire was smoldering in the heart of a child who watched the world with piercing eyes that seemed to see far beyond the immediate horizon of the harbor. He did not play with the simple toys of other children, nor did he find comfort in the idle chatter of the marketplace. Instead, he observed with a chilling intensity the way the wind shifted the white sails in the bay, and the way the occupying French soldiers marched through the streets with a mechanical discipline that felt both alien and intoxicating to his young mind. To truly understand the man who would one day seize a crown and place it upon his own head, one must first understand the lonely boy who stood on these jagged shores, feeling the cold sting of the salt spray on his face, while the rest of humanity remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering within his soul. The house in Ajaccio was not a palace of luxury, but it was a fortress of raw ambition and ancestral pride. Letizia Ramolino, the matriarch of this future titan, was a woman of steel and silence who had once followed her husband to the front lines of war while pregnant. She raised her children with a Spartan discipline that mirrored the harsh and unforgiving landscape of their island home. It was from her that the boy learned that survival was never a matter of luck, but a calculated matter of iron will and endurance. In those early years, the boy walked the narrow, cobblestone streets of his birthplace as a shadow among shadows. He was a foreigner in his own land, a subject of a distant king he had never seen, speaking a Corsican dialect that felt like a coat that did not quite fit the French identity being forced upon him. Yet, within the heavy silence of the Casa Bonaparte, the seeds of a completely new world order were being sown in the dark. The boy looked at the ancient maps on his father's wooden desk not as mere paper and ink, but as complex puzzles waiting to be solved by a superior mind. The Mediterranean was his first and most demanding teacher, and its lesson was crystal clear. The sea and the world belong only to those who dare to cross the boundaries set by others. The storm was rising, not from the thunderclouds over the mountains, but from the very earth of Ajaccio itself. It was a storm that would eventually roar across the frozen peaks of the Alps, through the shifting sands of the Egyptian deserts, and into the burning heart of the Russian winter. But here, in this quiet beginning, there was only a small, silent boy, the sharp smell of the sea, and a massive destiny that was patiently waiting for the exact right moment to strike the world with the force of a falling star. To know the man who would one day redraw the map of Europe with the tip of a blood-stained sword, one must first find the lonely boy wandering the rocky edges of a forgotten and rebellious island. He was a child of the mountains who learned to read the shifting patterns of the storm clouds before he could even read a formal battle map. The shadows of the Corsican coast were not merely darkness and absence of light. They were the silent blueprints of a rebellion that would never truly leave his heart, no matter how many palaces he eventually occupied. He walked the thin, dangerous line between an ancestral loyalty to his own blood and the inevitable, magnetic pull of the very conquerors who had humbled his people. The rugged landscape of Corsica was a harsh and demanding mistress that offered no comfort to the weak or the indecisive. In the years following his birth, the young Napoleon moved through a world that felt like a permanent battlefield even in times of supposed peace. The scent of the Mediterranean was always there, heavy with salt and the ancient memory of Phoenician and Roman sails. But now it was tainted by the pervasive presence of the French military uniform. For the boy, every street in Ajaccio was a lesson in the architecture of power and the bitter reality of occupation. He watched from the shadows of stone doorways as the French officers paraded with an air of effortless superiority, their polished boots clicking against the very stones that his ancestors had fought to defend. This was the crucible of his identity. He was a subject of the French king, yet his soul was woven from the wild Maquis and the granite peaks of a land that refused to be truly tamed. The young boy spent countless hours away from the noise of his siblings, seeking the solitude of the high cliffs where the wind howled like a wounded animal. There, he would sit for hours, staring out at the vast blue expanse of the sea, imagining the worlds that lay beyond the horizon. He was not looking for escape. He was looking for a way to dominate the space that had been forced upon him. His mind was already a fortress, a place where he could retreat and calculate the movements of an invisible enemy. The tension within the Casa Bonaparte was a reflection of the tension in the streets. His father, Carlo, had once been a fierce aide to the legendary resistance leader Pasquale Paoli, but he had eventually chosen the path of pragmatism and cooperation with the French authorities. This was a wound that the young Napoleon felt deeply, even if he did not yet have the words to express it. He saw his father's transition into the French nobility not as a triumph, but as a necessary surrender that carried a heavy price. In contrast, his mother Letizia remained the pillar of Corsican strength, a woman whose every gesture commanded a silent respect, and whose stories of the war for independence were the only fairy tales the boy ever cared to hear. She spoke of the mountains as cathedrals of liberty and the sea as a barrier that could be both a shield and a prison. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the foundation of his strategic thinking. He learned early that geography was destiny, and that those who controlled the high ground controlled the fate of men. As he grew older, his isolation only deepened. He was a boy of small stature but possessed a gaze that made even grown men feel unsettled and exposed. He did not find joy in the trivial games of his peers, who often mocked his heavy accent and his intense, brooding nature. Instead, he found a strange and cold comfort in books and maps, devouring the histories of great men like Alexander and Caesar as if they were long-lost relatives calling out to him across the centuries. He saw in their lives a pattern of will-over circumstance that resonated with his own internal fire. The shadows of the Corsican coast were his playground, and the history of the world was his only true companion. He began to see his own life not as a series of random events, but as a mission that was yet to be revealed. The French were everywhere, and while he hated their presence, he was secretly fascinated by their order, their science, and their absolute confidence in their own civilization. It was a complex dance of resentment and admiration that would define his entire youth. He was a Corsican patriot who was slowly realizing that to save his island, or perhaps to rule the world, he would have to master the tools of the very people he considered his enemies. The storm that had begun in Ajaccio was now moving inland, gathering strength in the silence of his studies and the solitude of his walks along the cliffs. The boy was becoming a weapon, forged in the shadows and sharpened by the cold winds of the Mediterranean. The warm embrace of the Mediterranean was replaced by the biting frost of northern France, a world of gray skies and cold stone, where a young boy's soul would be tempered like a blade in ice. He stepped off the ship not as a conqueror, but as a charity student with a name that sounded like a riddle to French ears and an accent that carried the weight of a conquered island. In this kingdom of aristocrats, he was a ghost in a blue uniform, a stranger in the very heart of the empire he would one day dismantle and rebuild. The transition from the wild, sun-drenched cliffs of Ajaccio to the rigid discipline of the military school at Brienne-le-Chateau was a violent shock to the young Napoleon system. Here, at the age of only 9, he was thrust into a society that valued lineage above merit and elegance above strength. The corridors of the school were filled with the sons of the French nobility, boys who had been born into wealth and who looked upon this thin, brooding Corsican with a mixture of amusement and contempt. To them, he was Le Pélonèse, a cruel mockery of his name that echoed through the stone halls. He was poor in a world of gold, and he was a patriot of a land they considered a mere colony. This isolation did not break him. Instead, it became his fortress. He retreated into the silence of the school library, seeking the company of the dead over the taunts of the living. While others played games of leisure, he studied the campaigns of the great captains of antiquity with a hunger that bordered on obsession. He devoured the mathematics of artillery and the geometry of fortifications as if they were the keys to his own liberation. The cold, damp rooms of Brienne were the laboratory where his iron will was forged. He learned the most valuable lesson of his life in those lonely years, that the mind can conquer any circumstance if the spirit refuses to surrender. The winter of 1783 would provide the world with a glimpse of the genius that lay dormant within the quiet outsider. A massive snowfall had turned the courtyard of Brienne into a white wasteland, and while the other students saw only a distraction from their lessons, Napoleon saw a battlefield. He did not just participate in a common snow fight, he organized it. He commanded his peers to build intricate fortifications, bastions, and trenches with a precision that stunned his instructors. For weeks, he conducted a systematic siege, leading his troops with a tactical brilliance that turned a childhood game into a masterclass in military science. Even in the freezing cold, with his hands numb and his face red from the biting wind, his eyes remained fixed on the objective with a terrifying focus. He was no longer the bullied outsider. He was a commander of men, testing the limits of leadership and the mechanics of human conflict. The snow fortress of Brienne was the first of many walls he would eventually tear down. Yet, despite these flashes of brilliance, the weight of his loneliness remained a constant companion. He wrote letters home that were filled with a profound sense of duty, but also a haunting awareness of his own displacement. He was a man without a country, no longer fully Corsican in the eyes of his people, and never truly French in the eyes of his peers. This duality was the source of his greatest strength and his deepest sorrow. It allowed him to look at the French monarchy from the outside, to see its cracks and its decadence with a clarity that those born within it could never possess. He was a predator in the making, watching the old world rot from within while he mastered the tools it provided. He was learning their language, their tactics, and their history, but he was keeping his heart for himself. The boy who walked the frozen grounds of Brienne was a silent storm, gathering energy and mass with every insult he endured and every book he mastered. He was the outsider who was learning how to become the ultimate insider. The shadows of the Corsican coast had followed him to France, but here, they were turning into the blueprints of a global empire. The world was still looking at a thin, lonely student with a strange name, but the stars were already aligning for the man who would soon make the entire world speak his name in whispers of awe and terror. They look at the smoke-filled battlefield and see only chaos and the desperate cries of dying men, but he looks at the same horizon and sees only geometry and the cold logic of numbers. To most, war is a storm of emotion and luck, but to the young lieutenant from Corsica, it was a grand equation waiting for its final solution. Long before he commanded millions, he mastered the art of calculating the exact trajectory of a cannonball and the precise angle of a killing blow. In the world of the old aristocracy, battles were won by names and titles, but in the new world he was building, battles would be won by the unwavering laws of physics and the brutal efficiency of a mind that never slept. The move from the cold walls of Brienne to the prestigious École Militaire in the heart of Paris was not just a change of scenery, it was a descent into the very center of a dying sun. Paris in the mid-1780s was a city of extreme contrasts, a place where the gilded carriages of the nobility splashed mud onto the starving masses who watched with hollow eyes. For the young Napoleon, the city was a labyrinth of decadence that he despised yet felt compelled to conquer. He was no longer just an outsider, he was a poor scholarship student in a palace of excess. While his classmates spent their nights in the salons and gambling dens of the capital, he remained in his cramped quarters, surrounded by technical manuals and ink-stained maps. He lived on a single meal a day, often nothing more than a crust of dry bread and a bowl of cold soup, saving every cent to send back to his struggling family in Ajaccio. This poverty was not a burden to him. It was a sharpening stone for his resolve. He realized that in the coming upheaval, those who were soft would be crushed, and only those who were as hard as the iron of their cannons would survive to see the new dawn. It was during this time that the sudden death of his father, Carlo, shifted the entire weight of the Bonaparte family onto his thin shoulders. At only 16 years old, he became the de facto head of his house, a responsibility that could have broken a lesser man, but only served to accelerate his maturity. He did not have the luxury of time or the comfort of a slow education. He pushed himself with a terrifying intensity, completing the rigorous 2-year course of study in just 1 year, becoming the first Corsican to ever graduate as an officer of the elite artillery branch. He chose the artillery because it was the arm of science and calculation, the only place where a man of talent could rise regardless of his birthright. He understood that while a sword is the weapon of a gentleman, a cannon is the weapon of a god. He spent his days studying the chemical composition of gunpowder and the structural integrity of fortifications, treating every piece of information as a weapon to be stored for later use. His first posting at Valence was a period of intense intellectual preparation and quiet observation. He was a second lieutenant in a world that was beginning to tremble with the first tremors of revolution. The air was thick with the scent of change, but Napoleon remained a silent observer, a student of the shifting winds. He spent his small salary on books instead of wine, filling his mind with the philosophies of the Enlightenment and the military theories of the past. He walked the banks of the Rhone River alone, tracing the movements of imaginary armies across the landscape. He was learning to see the world not as it was, but as a series of tactical opportunities. He understood that power was not a permanent gift, but a fluid force that moved toward those who were prepared to seize it. The mathematics of war were becoming the governing principle of his entire existence. He was no longer just a boy from an island or a student in a blue coat. He was a master of trajectories, a man who knew exactly how much force was required to break a line or topple a throne. The storm that had begun in the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio was now a calculated hurricane, waiting for the old world to finally crack open and provide the stage for his grand entrance. The world rarely notices the exact moment when a spark becomes a wildfire. Yet in the winter of 1793, the horizon of southern France began to glow with a light that would eventually consume the entire old order of Europe. They say that opportunity is a silent visitor that only stays for those who have already prepared a place for it at the table. For a young and obscure artillery captain, the port city of Toulon was not just a military objective. It was the altar where his previous years of silent study and cold calculation would finally be sacrificed to the god of war. The fires that lit the harbor that year were not just the flames of burning ships. They were the funeral pyre of the world as it had been known, and the blinding birth of a legend that would never truly die. The French Revolution had torn the country apart, leaving it bleeding and vulnerable to the predatory gaze of the European monarchies who wished to crush the Republican experiment in its cradle. Toulon, the crown jewel of the French Mediterranean fleet, had committed the ultimate sin of betrayal by opening its gates to the British and Spanish navies. To the leaders in Paris, this was an open wound that threatened to infect the entire South, but to the military commanders on the ground, it was an impossible knot that they lacked the intelligence to untie. The revolutionary armies were filled with passion but lacked the cold, structural logic of professional warfare. Into this theater of incompetence walked a 24-year-old Corsican with a thin face, unkempt hair, and a gaze that felt like a physical weight on anyone he looked at. He was a man of science in a world of slogans, and he immediately saw what the older generals could not perceive. He did not look at the city as a target, but as a geometric problem. He understood that the British fleet was the lifeblood of the occupation, and that if he could control the heights overlooking the harbor, he could make the sea itself a trap for the very ships that claimed to rule the waves. The siege was a grueling testament to his endurance and his absolute refusal to accept the limitations of others. He worked through the freezing nights and the mud-slicked days, personally positioning every battery and calculating every trajectory with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. He slept on the cold earth among his men, wrapped in a simple cloak, proving that he was not just a master of mathematics but a master of the human spirit. He renamed one of his key batteries, the Battery of the Men Without Fear, a psychological masterstroke that turned ordinary soldiers into fanatical instruments of his will. He was everywhere at once, correcting the aim of a gunner here, reorganizing a supply line there, and always watching the horizon with those haunting eyes that seemed to be counting the seconds until the world changed forever. He suffered a bayonet wound to his thigh during a fierce skirmish, a physical mark of his baptism by fire, but he refused to let the pain cloud his strategic vision. He knew that the moment was coming, a singular point in time where the mathematics of his study would meet the brutal reality of the bayonet. On the night of December 17th, amidst a torrential downpour and the deafening roar of a thunderstorm, the final assault began. The young captain led his men through the darkness and the chaos, capturing the key fort of Elba that he had identified months before as the Little Gibraltar of the harbor. Once the heights were secured, he did not celebrate. He immediately began the work of destruction. He turned his cannons toward the British fleet anchored below, turning the harbor into a cauldron of fire and screaming iron. The British, realizing their position had become a death trap, were forced into a panicked and humiliating retreat, burning their own ships as they fled into the dark expanse of the open sea. The sight of the burning harbor reflected in the eyes of the young Corsican was a premonition of the decades to come. He had taken a desperate situation and turned it into a masterpiece of tactical brilliance. The leaders in Paris could no longer ignore the genius in their midst. Within days, the obscure captain was promoted to brigadier general, skipping several ranks in a single leap of destiny. The fires of Toulon had tempered the blade that would soon cut through the heart of Europe. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio was gone, and in his place stood the architect of a new age, a man who had proven that the world belongs to the one who can master both the mathematics of the mind and the fires of the battlefield. The streets of Paris are pavestones of history, but in the autumn of 1795, those stones were ready to be washed in the blood of a dying republic. They thought the revolution had run out of energy and that the old ghosts of the monarchy could simply walk back through the gates of power. They were wrong. They did not count on the man who viewed a city street not as a place of protest, but as a narrow corridor of fire. He did not see a crowd of 30,000 rebels. He saw a target that required a specific weight of iron to be silenced forever. The world would soon learn that mercy is a luxury for those who do not understand the cold physics of survival. The year was 1795, and the French Revolution was cannibalizing itself in a cycle of chaos and indecision. The National Convention was under siege, not by foreign armies, but by its own people. A massive royalist uprising was gathering strength in the heart of Paris. 30,000 armed men determined to tear down the government and restore the throne of the Bourbons. The city was a powder keg, and the men in power were paralyzed by fear and the memory of the guillotine. They needed a savior, but they found a soldier who lacked a soul for hesitation. Into this desperate vacuum of leadership stepped the hero of Toulon, now a general without a command, walking the streets of the capital with a hungry gaze and a mind that was already calculating the angles of the urban intersections. When the call came to defend the convention, Napoleon did not ask for political guidance. He asked for the keys to the artillery park at Sablons. He knew that in the narrow streets of a city, a single cannon is worth more than 1,000 speeches. While the politicians trembled in their velvet chairs, the young general spent the night of October 5th preparing a trap of steel and gunpowder. He did not wait for the enemy to reach the doors of the palace. Instead, he positioned his guns at the Saint-Roch Church and along the strategic bridges of the Seine, turning the grand avenues of Paris into killing zones. He was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he watched the sun rise over a city that was about to witness a massacre. He understood that power is not a matter of right or wrong, but a matter of who controls the decisive point at the decisive moment. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the static tension of thousands of men marching toward their own destruction. The royalists approached with the confidence of numbers, shouting slogans of the old world, unaware that they were walking into a geometric nightmare designed by a master of trajectories. When the order was finally given, it was not a shout of passion but a cold command of necessity. The roar of the cannons shattered the morning silence, and the air was filled with the whistling scream of grape shot, small iron balls that turned the narrow streets into a shredding machine. It was not a battle, it was an execution by artillery. The stones of Paris were painted red in an instant as the lead tore through the ranks of the rebels with a mechanical indifference. Napoleon did not flinch. He watched the carnage with the same analytical gaze he had used to study his books at Brienne. To him, the blood was merely the ink that signed the contract of his own ascent. He had saved the Republic, but in doing so, he had proven that the Republic was now his to command. The whiff of grape shot had cleared the streets, but it had also cleared the path to the throne. By the time the smoke cleared over the Seine, the young general was the most famous man in France. The politicians who had feared the mob now feared the man who had crushed it. He was no longer just an officer of the artillery. He was the General Vendémiaire, the sword of the revolution and the architect of order. He had looked into the eyes of the beast and found that it was easily broken by a mind that understood the mathematics of violence. The world was changing, and the boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio was no longer a shadow in the hallways of power. He was the center of the storm, a man who had proven that he could silence a rebellion with the same precision he used to calculate the path of a star. The era of words was over, and the era of the sword had begun. The path was now open, leading across the Alps and into the heart of history itself. They say a man who can command the movements of tens of thousands cannot be moved by the whisper of a single voice, but they are wrong. The conqueror of Toulon and the savior of the Convention met his match not on a smoke-filled battlefield of iron, but in the perfumed air of a flickering Parisian salon. Before he would lead the armies of France across the frozen peaks of the Alps, he would fall before a woman whose only weapons were her effortless elegance and the haunted depth of her weary eyes. He could calculate the trajectory of a cannonball with supernatural precision, but he could not calculate the chaotic and unpredictable orbit of the human heart. The Paris of 1795 was a city trying to forget the blood of the guillotine and the suffocating shadow of the Great Terror. In the gilded salons of the new elite, a feverish energy had taken hold, a desperate desire to live and love before the next wave of chaos arrived. Into this world of silk and scandal walked the young General Bonaparte, a man who still smelled of gunpowder and whose clothes were often ill-fitting and worn. He was a creature of the camp and the study, awkward in the dance of social graces and blunt in his speech. Yet, it was here that he encountered Marie-Joseph Rose de Beauharnais, a widow of the Revolution who had barely escaped the blade that took her husband's life. She was 6 years older than him, a mother of 2 from the distant island of Martinique, possessing a grace that made the young general feel like a clumsy provincial student once again. She was not merely a woman to him. She was the embodiment of the high society he had always viewed from the outside. Their meeting was a collision of 2 vastly different worlds. Napoleon was drawn to her with an intensity that bordered on the religious, a total and absolute obsession that he had previously reserved only for his maps and his cannons. He did not see a graceful widow who was navigating the treacherous waters of French politics for survival. He saw a goddess of destiny who held the key to his own inner peace. He renamed her Josephine, a name he alone would call her, as if by changing her name he could claim her very soul. He wrote her letters that were filled with a raw and almost frightening passion, words that burned with the same fire he used to command his batteries at Toulon. He told her that she was the only one who could make him forget the weight of the world and the cold calculations of war. To the world, he was a rising star of the military, but in the privacy of his writing desk, he was a man begging for the attention of a woman who was at first merely amused by his ferocity. Josephine was a pragmatic creature of the New France. She saw in the young general not just a lover, but a protector and a ladder back to the security she had lost. She recognized the power that simmered beneath his awkward exterior, a force that was moving the stars toward a new alignment. On March 9, 1796, they were married in a simple civil ceremony. Napoleon was late for his own wedding, delayed by the maps and the troop movements he was organizing for the coming campaign in Italy. There were no grand cathedrals and no royal guests, only a small gold ring inscribed with the words to destiny. It was a union of ambition and obsession, a contract signed in the shadow of a war that was already calling him away from her arms. 2 days after the wedding, the general left his new bride to take command of the army of Italy. He carried her portrait over his heart like a protective talisman, looking at it every hour as he rode toward the mountains. He was leaving the salons of Paris behind to face the combined forces of Austria and Piedmont, but his mind remained trapped in the memory of Josephine's scent and the sound of her voice. He realized that his conquest of Italy was not just for the glory of the Republic, but a tribute he wished to lay at her feet. The mathematics of war were now being driven by the logic of love. The boy from Ajaccio had found his empress long before he ever found his throne. The storm was now moving toward the Alps, but it carried with it a new and dangerous vulnerability. He had conquered the heart of a woman, and in doing so, he had given fate a weapon that could be used against him in the years of glory that were yet to come. The world believed that an army was a collection of men, weapons, and supplies, but he knew that an army was first and foremost a collection of dreams and desperate hungers. When the young General Bonaparte arrived in the shadow of the Alps to take command of the army of Italy, he did not find a glorious force of the Republic. He found 38,000 ghosts, starving men with rags for uniforms and bare feet that bled onto the frozen mountain passes. They were the forgotten soldiers of a bankrupt government, men who had lost their faith in everything except the cold weight of their muskets. But where others saw a hopeless ruin, he saw a thunderbolt waiting to be thrown at the heart of the old world. He did not offer them bread or boots at first. He offered them the entire world. The campaign of 1796 would become the blueprint for a new kind of warfare, a lightning-fast storm that moved with a speed that defied the traditional logic of the 18th century. Napoleon did not fight like the aristocratic generals of Austria or Piedmont, who treated war like a slow and dignified game of chess. He fought like a force of nature, breaking every rule of the military academies he had once attended. He understood that speed was the ultimate multiplier of force, and that a smaller army moving twice as fast was effectively twice as large. He stripped his troops of everything that slowed them down, teaching them to live off the land and to march until their hearts nearly burst. He was no longer just a mathematician of the artillery. He was a master of human psychology who knew how to turn a soldier's resentment into a weapon of total conquest. The Italian landscape, with its ancient cities and fertile plains, became a chessboard where he outplayed the veteran commanders of Europe before they even realized the game had begun. The series of victories was so rapid that it felt like a single, continuous explosion of French power. In just 2 weeks, the young general won 6 battles and knocked the kingdom of Piedmont out of the war. He moved through the mountain passes like a phantom, appearing where he was least expected and striking with a concentrated fury that shattered the enemy's morale. At the Bridge of Lodi, he proved that he was not a general who commanded from the safety of the rear. He personally led the charge across a narrow wooden span under a lethal storm of Austrian grape shot, earning the nickname, the Little Corporal, from his men who watched him defy death with a chilling calm. This was the moment his soldiers realized that they were not being led by a man, but by a destiny. They saw in his eyes the same blue fire that he had seen in the Mediterranean as a child, a cold and unwavering light that promised both victory and immortality. The Austrian generals, old men who lived by the rules of the past, were paralyzed by this new and terrifying reality. They complained that Napoleon did not know how to fight because he did not wait for the sun to rise or for the terrain to be favorable. They did not understand that for him, the only rule was victory, and the only terrain was the mind of the enemy. He swept through the Po Valley like a mountain torrent, taking Milan and laying siege to the great fortress of Mantua. He was no longer just a general of the Republic. He was a sovereign in all but name, negotiating treaties and redrawing the borders of ancient states as he saw fit. He sent millions of francs in gold and crates of stolen masterpieces back to Paris, feeding the hungry treasury of the government while building his own legend in the hearts of the French people. Yet, amidst the thunder of the cannons and the cheers of his victorious troops, he remained a man haunted by the silence of his personal life. Between battles, he sat in his tent by the light of a flickering candle, writing frantic and desperate letters to Josephine. He told her that his victories were empty without her presence, and that every city he conquered was merely a gift he wanted to place at her feet. He was conquering a nation while being a prisoner of a woman's ghost. The Italian thunder was echoing across all of Europe, reaching the ears of kings in London and emperors in St. Petersburg, who began to realize that the world they knew was ending. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had become the master of the Italian peninsula, proving that with enough will and a perfect understanding of the mathematics of violence, a single man could indeed move the mountains. The storm was no longer rising. It was raining fire upon the old order, and the world was beginning to understand that the name Bonaparte was not a riddle, but a command. The bridge over the Alpes River was not a grand structure of marble and stone. It was a narrow, rickety wooden span that would barely have been noticed in times of peace. Yet, in the cold November of 1796, this forgotten crossing near the village of Arcole became the fulcrum upon which the entire fate of the Italian campaign would balance. The Austrian army, heavily reinforced and desperate to break the siege of Mantua, had boxed the French into a deadly swamp where movement was impossible, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and impending defeat. For the first time in his lightning war, the young general was not the hunter, but the prey. The battle for Arcole was not a contest of grand maneuvers, but a brutal, muddy brawl fought on narrow dikes and causeways, where the numbers of the enemy were matched by the grim determination of a few thousand French soldiers who refused to let their dream die in the mud. The Austrians had fortified the village on the far side of the bridge, turning the crossing into a corridor of death that was constantly swept by the withering fire of their muskets and cannons. For 3 days, the French threw themselves against this impossible obstacle, only to be repulsed time and again by a wall of lead and iron. The bridge was piled high with the bodies of the brave and the foolish, a grotesque monument to the stalemate. It was on the 3rd day that the general understood that tactics had failed and that only a symbol could break the psychological deadlock. He saw that his men were losing their nerve. their eyes reflecting the fear of a defeat that would undo all they had achieved. He did not send another officer to lead the charge. He dismounted from his horse, a small figure in a simple blue greatcoat, and grabbed a tricolor flag from a fallen ensign. The wind whipped the flag around his body as he ran onto the blood-slicked wooden planks of the bridge, the only moving target in a landscape of death. He was not just a man holding a piece of cloth. He was the living embodiment of the Republic, a walking defiance against the old world that was trying to crush him. The air around him exploded with the hiss of bullets, the wood of the bridge splintering under his feet. Men fell all around him, their cries swallowed by the roar of the guns. One of his aides grabbed him and pulled him into the muddy ditch by the side of the causeway, saving him from certain death. But the image had already been burned into the minds of his soldiers. They had seen their general willing to die for a few feet of wooden planks, and the shame of their hesitation turned into a fanatical rage. The final assault that followed was not a military maneuver, but a collective act of primal fury. The French soldiers, their uniforms covered in mud and blood, stormed across the bridge like a tidal wave that could not be stopped by any mortal force. They overwhelmed the Austrian defenders with a ferocity that broke their spirit, driving them out of the village and securing the crossing. The Battle of Arcole was won, not by a brilliant flank attack or a clever feint, but by the raw and terrifying will of a single man who refused to accept the reality of the situation. The cost was enormous, but the victory was absolute. The Austrian army was broken, and the siege of Mantua could continue. The boy from Ajaccio had proven that he was not just a master of the chessboard, but a warrior king who could inspire men to march into the mouth of hell with a flag in his hand. The Bridge of Arcole became a sacred site in the mythology of the Napoleonic legend, a place where the man and the destiny became one. The storm that had begun on the cliffs of Corsica was now unstoppable, its fury forged in the mud of an Italian swamp and fueled by the blood of those who believed that a small man in a blue coat was the harbinger of a new world. The desert does not keep secrets. It only buries them beneath the shifting sands of time to wait for a mind capable of unearthing the past. They say that a man's ambition is limited by the horizon he can see, but for General Bonaparte, the horizon of Europe was no longer enough to contain the fire within his soul. He looked toward the east, toward the ancient cradle of civilization, and saw not just a land of dust and ruins, but a gateway to immortality that would place his name alongside the legends of Alexander and Caesar. The silence of the Sahara was about to be broken by the rhythmic thunder of a modern army that brought with it both the instruments of war and the tools of science. The campaign in Egypt was a daring and desperate gamble, a leap into the unknown that was designed to strike at the very heart of the British Empire's trade routes to India. In the early summer of 1798, a massive French fleet slipped past the watchful eyes of the Royal Navy, carrying 35,000 soldiers and a small army of scientists, artists, and engineers known as the savants. Napoleon understood that to conquer the Orient, he needed to do more than just defeat its warriors. He needed to master its history and decode its ancient mysteries. The voyage across the Mediterranean was a tense and silent journey through the mist, a movement of thousands of men toward a destiny that felt more like a dream than a military operation. When the French finally landed on the scorched sands of Alexandria, they found a world that had not changed in 1,000 years, a place where the heat was a physical weight and the wind felt like the breath of a dying god. The march toward Cairo was a grueling test of endurance that pushed the French soldiers to the absolute limits of their sanity. The sun was a relentless enemy that turned their heavy wool uniforms into instruments of torture and their metal canteens into burning weights. Men went mad from thirst, seeing mirages of cool lakes that vanished as they approached, while the local Bedouin tribes hovered on the edges of the columns like shadows, striking at anyone who fell behind. Yet, at the center of this suffering rode the general, seemingly immune to the heat and the dust, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouettes of the pyramids that rose from the desert floor like jagged teeth of eternity. He knew that the decisive moment was approaching, a clash between the medieval courage of the East and the mathematical precision of the West. On July 21st, near the village of Mbebe, the French army finally faced the legendary Mamelukes, a warrior caste that had ruled Egypt for centuries with a ferocity that was whispered about in the courts of Europe. The Mamelukes were masters of the horse and the blade, charging with a chaotic and beautiful fury that had shattered every invader who dared to cross their path. But Napoleon did not fight with fury. He fought with the cold logic of the square. He ordered his infantry to form massive, hollow squares of bayonets, creating human fortresses that could fire in every direction. As the Mameluke cavalry thundered across the sand, shouting their war cries and waving their curved scimitars, they were met not by a retreating mob, but by a disciplined wall of fire and lead. It was not a battle so much as a collision between two different eras of human history. The mathematics of the French square proved superior to the individual bravery of the desert horsemen. The Mamelukes broke against the bayonets like waves against a rock, their power evaporating in a cloud of gunpowder smoke under the watchful gaze of the Sphinx. Standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid of Giza, Napoleon looked upon his exhausted troops and reminded them that 40 centuries of history were watching their every move from the heights of the ancient stones. He had conquered Cairo and established himself as a modern pharaoh, but he had also unleashed something far more powerful than a military occupation. The scientists he brought with them began the monumental task of documenting every temple, every tomb, and every inscription they found. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during this campaign would eventually unlock the language of the pharaohs, allowing the silent statues to finally speak to a modern world. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had not just won a battle, he had bridged the gap between the living and the dead. The echoes of the pyramids were now carrying his name into the halls of eternity, but the desert was also a prison. Behind him, the British fleet under Admiral Nelson had destroyed his ships at the Battle of the Nile, leaving the French army stranded in a land of gold and dust. The general was now a king without a kingdom, a conqueror caught in a beautiful trap of his own making, waiting for the next turn of the wheel of fate to lead him back to the center of the world. The dream of an Eastern empire began to shimmer and dissolve like a heat haze on the horizon of the unforgiving Levant, revealing the cold and jagged reality of a war that could not be won with mathematics alone. They say that every conqueror eventually meets a wall that will not break, and for the young General Bonaparte, that wall was not made of stone or iron, but of the endless sand and the invisible plague that haunted the shadows of the Holy Land. The hero who had stood in the shadow of the pyramids now found himself a prisoner of his own ambition, chasing a glory that remained forever just out of reach in the burning distance. The year was 1799, and the French army in Egypt was an island of steel surrounded by a sea of hostile silence. With the British fleet controlling the Mediterranean, the path back to France was closed, and the only way forward lay through the ancient dust of Syria and Palestine. Napoleon led 13,000 of his finest troops into the desert, a movement that was supposed to be a triumphal march but quickly turned into a descent into a waking nightmare. The heat was a physical enemy that clawed at their throats, and the thirst was a madness that made men claw at the dry earth in search of a drop of moisture. The young general rode at the head of the column, his face a mask of iron determination. But even he could not ignore the growing sense that the East was a labyrinth designed to swallow those who dared to enter its deepest chambers. The capture of Jaffa was a moment of profound darkness that would forever stain the legend of the rising sun. After a brutal siege, the city fell, and the French soldiers unleashed a fury that had been fueled by the horrors of the Desert March. Thousands were executed on the beaches, their cries lost in the roar of the surf, an act of calculated brutality that Napoleon believed was necessary for survival, but which the world would remember as a mark of a soul that had become as cold as the flint of a musket. Yet, even as the smoke cleared over Jaffa, a more terrifying enemy was waiting in the shadows. The bubonic plague began to move through the ranks like a silent reaper, turning the pride of the French army into a collection of shivering and dying men. In the hospitals of the Holy Land, the general performed a masterstroke of psychological warfare, walking among the infected and touching their sores to prove that fear was the only thing to be truly feared. It was an image of a god-king among his people, but beneath the theater was the terrifying realization that his army was rotting from within while the enemy remained entrenched behind the walls of Acre. The siege of Acre became the grave of his eastern dreams. For 62 days, the French threw themselves against the fortifications of the ancient city, only to be repulsed by the combined strength of the Ottoman defenders and the British naval guns under Sir Sidney Smith. For the first time in his life, the mathematics of Napoleon's artillery failed to break the will of his opponent. He watched from his command tent as his best officers fell in the mud and the ruins, realizing that the path to India was being blocked by a single small fortress on the edge of the sea. He was a master of trajectories who had finally met an immovable object. The retreat from Acre was a slow and agonizing crawl back toward the Nile, a journey through a landscape of suffering where the dying were left behind to the mercy of the desert wind. The mirage of an empire in the Orient was fading, replaced by the urgent necessity of returning to a France that was once again trembling on the brink of total collapse. The general returned to Cairo as a conqueror in name, but he knew the truth that lay hidden beneath the triumphal parades. He had won battles but lost the war for the East. He began to spend his nights staring at the old newspapers from Europe, reading of the defeats the French armies were suffering on the Rhine and in Italy. He realized that his destiny was no longer in the shadow of the pyramids, but in the chaos of Paris. He was a man who knew when to leave a sinking ship and when to seize a rising tide. In the dead of night, he slipped away from his army on a small frigate, leaving his soldiers to face the inevitable surrender while he sailed across a sea infested with British cruisers. He was moving toward a new horizon, a place where the crown of France was waiting for a man who had the courage to take it. The boy from Ajaccio had survived the desert and the plague, and while the Eastern dream had been a mirage, the fire in his soul was now hotter than the sun of the Sahara, ready to burn a path to the very top of the world. They say a crown is a heavy burden for the soul, but for a man who has already carried the crushing weight of a dying army across the burning sands of a desert, a throne is merely a seat of cold and calculated rest. The halls of power are not built of stone or marble alone. They are constructed from the heavy silence of the masses who wait for a master to give them a name and a purpose. When General Bonaparte stepped onto the shores of France in the autumn of 1799, he did not come as a runaway officer fleeing a failed campaign in the East. He came as a living legend, a phantom of victory who had returned to a country that had forgotten how to win and how to dream. The air in Paris was thick with the scent of decay and the stagnant breath of a government that had lost its moral compass, leaving a vacuum that only a sword forged in the fires of absolute will could fill. The landing at Frejus was not a military arrival. It was a religious experience for a nation that was drowning in chaos and corruption. The people did not ask about the soldiers left behind in the dust of Egypt, nor did they question the legality of his return without orders. They saw only the man who had humbled the Austrians and decoded the secrets of the pyramids. As he traveled toward Paris, the crowds lined the roads for miles, their cheers a rhythmic drumbeat that signaled the end of the revolutionary experiment and the beginning of something far more ancient and terrifying. Napoleon observed this adoration with the same analytical gaze he used to study a battlefield. He realized that the French people were no longer in love with the abstract ideals of liberty. They were in love with the promise of order and the intoxicating scent of glory. He was no longer just a general of the Republic. He was the architect of a new reality, preparing to build a monument to his own ambition on the ruins of 1,000 years of history. In the dimly lit salons of Paris, the young general became a master of a different kind of warfare. He traded his mud-stained uniform for the quiet attire of a scholar, attending the meetings of the Institute and speaking of science and philosophy with a calculated modesty that disarmed his enemies. He was playing a grand game of political chess, moving pieces through the shadows of the capital while the ruling directory crumbled under the weight of its own incompetence. He met with the conspirators, men like the calculating Sieyès and the serpent-like Talleyrand, who believed they could use the young general as a simple sword to clear the path for their own power. They did not understand that the man they were inviting into their inner circle was not a tool, but a force of nature that would eventually swallow them all. He listened more than he spoke, gathering the secrets of his rivals like a commander collecting maps of an enemy fortress. He was calculating the trajectory of his ascent with the same mathematical precision he used for his cannons at Toulon, knowing that in politics, as in war, timing is the difference between a hero and a traitor. The state of France was his greatest ally. The treasury was empty, the armies on the frontiers were retreating, and the streets of the capital were filled with the whispers of an impending civil war. The revolution had devoured its own children, and the survivors were exhausted and hungry for a stability that the weak men of the government could not provide. Napoleon saw that the fruit of power was ripe and hanging low, waiting for a hand strong enough to pluck it without trembling. He began to coordinate his move with a silent intensity, ensuring the loyalty of the soldiers in the Paris garrison and weaving a web of influence that reached into every corner of the state. He was no longer the outsider from Corsica or the lonely student of Brienne. He was the center of a gathering storm, a man who had mastered the tools of the old world to build the foundations of the new. As the winter of 1799 approached, the blueprints for the coup were finalized in the secret chambers of the capital. Napoleon knew that he was about to cross a river far more dangerous than the Po or the Nile. He was moving toward a confrontation with the very laws he had sworn to protect, prepared to tear up the contract of the past to write the history of the future in his own hand. He looked at the maps of Paris not as a city to be defended, but as a prize to be seized. The architect was ready, and the structures of power were waiting for the first blow of his hammer to fall. The world was blissfully unaware that the era of talk was over, and the era of the absolute was about to begin, led by a man who understood that the only true architecture is the one built upon the unwavering logic of the human spirit's desire for greatness. They say that history is written by the victors, but in the cold autumn of 1799, history was written by the tip of a bayonet and the unwavering silence of a man who knew that laws are only as strong as the hands that hold them. The world believes that revolutions end in the streets with the shouting of the masses, but they are wrong. The French Revolution did not die in a public square or under the blade of a guillotine. It died in the shadowed hallways of a palace called St. Cloud, smothered by the very man who had once sworn to protect it. The transition from a chaotic republic to a disciplined empire was not a sudden explosion, but a calculated theft of power that turned a soldier into a sovereign and a nation of citizens into a nation of subjects. The month of November 1799, known as Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, found the French Republic in a state of terminal exhaustion. The government of the Directory was a hollow shell of corruption and indecision, a group of men who had mastered the art of survival but forgotten the science of leadership. Into this vacuum of authority stepped the conspirators, led by the brilliant but cautious Sieyes, who believed that France needed a sword to restore order. They looked at General Bonaparte and saw a tool that could be used to clear the path for their own refined vision of a republic. They did not realize that the sword they were reaching for had a mind of its own, a mind that had already outgrown the boundaries of the laws they held so dear. Napoleon observed the political landscape with the cold eye of an artillery officer preparing a bombardment. He knew that the people were tired of words and hungry for stability, and he was prepared to give them exactly what they wanted in exchange for everything they had. The coup d'etat began not with a charge of cavalry, but with a complex dance of legal maneuvers and strategic lies. On the first day, the 18th of Brumaire, the legislative councils were moved to the Palace of St. Cloud under the pretext of an imaginary Jacobin conspiracy. This was a calculated isolation, a way to remove the politicians from the protective reach of the Parisian mob and surround them with the only force that Napoleon truly trusted: his own soldiers. The air at St. Cloud was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the static tension of a gathering storm. The deputies moved through the grand halls with a sense of impending doom, their voices echoing against the marble as they debated the survival of a constitution that was already being dismantled in the shadows. Napoleon stood in the center of the courtyard, his face a mask of iron silice, watching his grenadiers with an expression that told them exactly who their true master was. The following day, the 19th of Brumaire, was the moment where the mathematics of power met the chaotic reality of human emotion. When Napoleon entered the chamber of the Council of 500, he did not find a group of intimidated politicians ready to surrender. He found a den of lions, men who shouted down with the dictator and outlaw him as they swarmed around him in a frenzy of Republican outrage. For the first and perhaps only time in his life, the master of trajectories found himself lost in a storm of human anger. He fumbled his words, his face paled, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the hero of Italy and Egypt would be consumed by the very system he sought to overthrow. But destiny had not brought the boy from Ajaccio this far to let him fall in a hallway. It was his brother, Napoleon Bonaparte, the president of the council, who saved the day with a masterstroke of political theater. He stepped outside to the hesitating soldiers and pointed his sword at Napoleon's chest, swearing that he would kill his own brother if he ever betrayed the liberty of France. This was the signal the soldiers had been waiting for. They did not see a complex legal dispute or a violation of the Constitution. They saw their general in danger. The rhythmic beat of the drums began to roll through the halls of St. Cloud, a sound that signaled the end of the era of debate. The grenadiers, led by the fierce Murat, charged into the chamber with bayonets fixed, scattering the deputies like leaves in a winter gale. The windows were smashed. The robes of the politicians were caught on the thorns of the palace gardens as they fled into the mist. And by sunset, the Republic was a memory. The architect of power had struck his first blow, and the structures of the old world had crumbled at his touch. By the end of the night, a new government was formed, the consulate. Napoleon was named first consul, a title that carried the weight of ancient Rome and the absolute authority of a modern dictator. He was no longer just a general of the Republic, he was the master of France. He returned to Paris in a carriage that carried not just a man, but the future of Europe. He had looked into the eyes of the beast of chaos and found that it was easily tamed by a mind that understood the mathematics of order and the power of the sword. The turning point had been reached, and the path was now clear. The revolution was over, and the reign of the individual had begun. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had finally found his throne, and the world was beginning to realize that the storm was no longer a natural phenomenon, but a calculated work of art designed by a man who refused to be anything less than absolute. They say that chaos is the natural state of the world, and that order is merely a fragile mask worn by the fearful. But for a man who views the earth as a series of complex equations, chaos is nothing more than a temporary failure of design. The fire of the revolution had burned for a decade, consuming the flesh of kings and the dreams of peasants alike, leaving behind only the cold and shifting ash of uncertainty. But where the politicians of the old world saw a ruin to be lamented, the first consul saw a blank canvas waiting for the ink of a master architect. He did not seek to restore the past, for the past was a broken clock that had stopped ticking in the blood of 1793. Instead, he sought to build a future that moved with the relentless and silent precision of a machine made of iron and law. The France that Napoleon inherited in the winter of 1799 was a nation of ghosts and shadows, a place where the currency was worthless and the roads were haunted by bandits who called themselves patriots. The Great Terror had left a vacuum in the soul of the people, a deep and hollow hunger for a stability that the shifting winds of democracy could not provide. The first consul did not begin his work with the sword, but with the quill and the map. He understood that to rule a nation, one must first define its boundaries and its logic. He moved with a terrifying industry, spending 20 hours a day at his desk, dictating a new world order to a small army of exhausted secretaries. He was no longer just a general of the artillery. He was the chief engineer of a civilization that was being born in the silence of his study. His crowning achievement was the Civil Code, a monumental structure of logic that would eventually be known by his own name. Before him, France was a patchwork of thousands of local laws and ancient customs that contradicted one another like the whispers of a madman. He replaced this confusion with a single, unified code of conduct that was as clear as a geometric theorem. He established the equality of men before the law, the right to property, and the secular nature of the state, effectively ending the era of feudalism with the stroke of a pen. He did not believe in the abstract rights of the philosophers. He believed in the practical rights of the citizen who paid his taxes and served his country. The code was not just a book of laws. It was the blueprint for a modern society that valued merit over birth and efficiency over tradition. It was the mathematics of justice, applied with the same unwavering focus he had once used to position his cannons at the siege of Toulon. But the architect knew that a nation is not built of laws alone. It requires a heart and a spine. He established the Bank of France to breathe life back into the economy, stabilizing the currency and ensuring that the bread of the poor was no longer a matter of chance. He created the system of lycées, a network of schools designed to produce a new elite of administrators and officers who owed their loyalty not to a family name, but to the state itself. Perhaps his most daring move was the Concordat with the Catholic Church. He was not a man of deep faith, but he was a man of deep understanding. He realized that the cross was a more effective tool of order than the guillotine, and by bringing the church back into the fold of the state, He healed a wound that had been bleeding since the first days of the revolution. He was not surrendering to the Pope. He was enlisting the heavens in the service of his own grand design. The central nervous system of his new empire was the bureaucracy of the prefects. He divided France into departments and placed a representative in each city who reported directly to him in Paris. It was a system of absolute centralization that turned the capital into the brain and the provinces into the limbs of a single, massive organism. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, his eyes peering into every tax ledger and every police report across the vast expanse of his domain. He was building a state that was as disciplined as a regiment and as efficient as a clock. The chaos of the mob was replaced by the silence of the office, and the shouting of the streets was replaced by the scratching of the quill. The first consul had looked upon the ruins of the old world and found that the only way to prevent its return was to build a structure so solid that it could withstand the weight of history itself. The storm was no longer a destructive force of nature. It had been captured and channeled into the engines of a modern state. The architect of power was finished with the foundations, and the world was beginning to see the first grand towers of an empire that promised to be as eternal as the granite mountains of Corsica. They say that a man who has conquered the earth must eventually conquer the heavens, for a crown of laurel is never enough for a soul that seeks to be eternal. The world believes that a throne is a destination, but for the man who once walked the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio, it was merely a fortification against the shifting winds of time and the daggers of the jealous. The Republic had been a dream of many, but the empire was the reality of one. On a cold winter day in the heart of Paris, the architect of power decided to clothe his ambition in the purple of the Caesars, turning a nation of citizens into a witness to his own apotheosis. The path to the imperial throne was paved not just with gold, but with the cold and calculated logic of survival. By the year 1804, the first consul had stabilized France, yet he knew that a single assassin's bullet could unravel everything he had built. The European monarchies looked upon his government as a temporary fever that would eventually pass, waiting for the day they could restore the old ghosts of the past. To secure his legacy and protect the new order, Napoleon realized that he must become more than a man. He must become a dynasty. He organized a national plebiscite, asking the people of France to grant him the title of Emperor of the French. The response was an overwhelming roar of approval, a collective surrender of liberty in exchange for the promise of a glorious and eternal stability. He was no longer the servant of the law, he was the source of it. The coronation at the Cathedral of Notre Dame on December 2nd, 1804, was a masterpiece of political theater and ancient ritual designed to stun the world into silence. The air inside the vast stone chamber was thick with the scent of incense, and the heavy silence of 5,000 guests who waited in the dim light for the arrival of a modern god. The walls were draped in silk and velvet, hiding the scars of the Revolution and the echoes of the guillotine. Napoleon arrived in a carriage of gold, wearing robes of crimson and ermine that weighed 80 pounds, a physical manifestation of the burden of the crown he was about to seize. He walked the long aisle with a slow and rhythmic precision, his eyes fixed not on the altar, but on the invisible point where his life and history would finally become one. Perhaps the most daring moment of his entire existence occurred when he reached the center of the cathedral. Pope Pius VII had been brought from Rome to bless the new emperor, a move intended to link the Napoleonic era with the sacred authority of the past. But as the Pope reached for the crown, Napoleon did not wait for the blessing of the heavens. He reached out with his own hands, took the golden circle of laurel leaves, and placed it upon his own head. It was a gesture of absolute defiance and supreme confidence, a declaration to the world that his power came from no one but himself and the edge of his own sword. He then crowned Josephine as empress, her knees trembling before the man who had turned her into a queen in a world that had once tried to take her life. The gilded throne was now occupied, and the mathematics of the artillery officer had finally produced the equation of a deity. The symbolism of the new empire was carefully curated to reflect both the past and the future. He replaced the revolutionary cockade with the golden bee, an ancient symbol of immortality and industry that dated back to the first kings of France. The eagle of Rome became the standard of his armies, a predatory bird that promised to carry his name across the borders of every kingdom in Europe. He was no longer Bonaparte. He was Napoleon, a singular name that resonated with the force of a thunderclap. In the salons of the Tuileries Palace, the atmosphere shifted from the meritocratic energy of the consulate to the rigid and glittering etiquette of an imperial court. He surrounded himself with a new nobility of merit, generals who had risen from the mud of the battlefield to become dukes and princes. He was building a new world order that was as structured as a geometry theorem and as solid as the granite of his birthplace. But beneath the gold leaf and the purple velvet, the man remained a prisoner of his own restless mind. He knew that a throne built on victory must be defended by victory. The European kings viewed him as an upstart, a crowned Jacobin who had stolen the honors of the blood. They did not understand that for Napoleon, the throne was not a place of rest, but a new command center. He was already looking at the maps of the continent, calculating the movements of the coalitions that were gathering against him. The storm was no longer a domestic phenomenon. It was a global tempest that was ready to break over the boundaries of France. The architect had finished the palace, and the emperor was now ready to march out of its gates to face the world in a final struggle for total dominance. The coronation was over, but the war for the soul of the earth was only just beginning. The boy from Ajaccio had found his throne, and now he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was the only one worthy to sit upon it. They say that the sun does not just light the world, it witnesses the birth and death of empires with a cold and indifferent eye. But on the 2nd of December 1805, exactly 1 year after he had placed the crown upon his own head, the sun rose over the frozen fields of Moravia as if it were a loyal servant of the French emperor. The world believes that victory is a matter of luck or superior numbers, but for the man who views the battlefield as a complex equation of time and space, victory is a masterpiece of deception and the absolute mastery of the human spirit's fear. The son of Austerlitz was not just a natural phenomenon. It was the spotlight of destiny shining upon the greatest military mind the world had ever known. The year 1805 found Napoleon facing the most formidable challenge of his imperial reign, the Third Coalition. The monarchs of Europe, led by the emperors of Russia and Austria, had gathered a massive army of nearly 90,000 men to crush the upstart from Corsica and restore the old balance of power. They looked at the maps and saw a French army that was outnumbered and overextended, believing that the time had finally come to trap the predator in his own ambition. But they did not understand that Napoleon was never more dangerous than when he appeared to be weak. He was not just preparing for a battle, he was choreographing a tragedy for his enemies, a grand trap designed to lure the Russian and Austrian giants into a web of their own arrogance. He deliberately abandoned the high ground of the Pratzen Heights, a move that any traditional general would consider madness, to entice the enemy into attacking his supposedly vulnerable right wing. As the mists of the early morning began to swirl over the icy marshes and the gold-tinged fields, the Allied emperors took the bait. They launched a massive assault on the French right, convinced that they were about to cut off Napoleon's line of retreat and win the war in a single blow. But the emperor stood on a distant hill, his eyes fixed on the movements of the enemy with a terrifying silence. He had calculated the exact time it would take for the Allied center to be thinned out as they moved their troops toward his right. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, a point in time where the mathematics of his strategy would meet the brutal reality of the bayonet. When he saw the Allied columns moving off the heights, he turned to Marshal Soult and uttered the words that would echo through history. "One sharp blow and the war is over." The French assault on the Pratzen Heights was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The hidden divisions of the Grand Armée emerged from the mist with a precision that stunned the Allied commanders. They did not just climb the heights, they seized them with a ferocity that broke the center of the coalition army in an instant. The world was suddenly turned upside down. The hunters had become the hunted, trapped in a pocket of fire and steel, while the French cannons began to roar from the very ground the Allies had just abandoned. The Russian and Austrian troops were forced back onto the frozen ponds of Sachin, where the weight of their own desperation and the relentless bombardment of French artillery turned the ice into a watery grave. The screams of the drowning and the roar of the guns created a symphony of destruction that signaled the absolute collapse of the Old World's military pride. By sunset, the Third Coalition had ceased to exist. Two emperors were in flight, their armies shattered and their confidence destroyed by a man they had once called a crowned Jacobin. Napoleon rode across the battlefield in the gathering dusk, his face illuminated by the flickering fires and the dying glow of the sun that now bore his name. He told his soldiers that they would be greeted with awe for the rest of their lives simply by saying, "I was at the Battle of Austerlitz." He had not just won a battle, he had redrawn the power structure of the entire continent. The Holy Roman Empire, a structure that had lasted for 1,000 years, would soon crumble into the dust of history as a direct result of this single day of fire and logic. The son of Austerlitz was the zenith of his military genius, a moment where his will and the laws of the universe seemed to operate in perfect harmony. He had proven that a mind that understands the geometry of war can overcome any number of enemies. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio was now the undisputed master of Europe, a man who could topple thrones with a gesture and create new kingdoms with a stroke of his pen. But even in this moment of supreme glory, the architect of power knew that the sun eventually sets. He looked toward the horizon, already calculating the next move of the kings who would never stop trying to extinguish his light. The storm was now a global hurricane, and though the sun was shining today, the mathematics of the future suggested that the clouds of a new and even greater struggle were already gathering in the cold distance. They say that a map is a permanent record of the Earth's surface and the immutable boundaries of nations. But for a man who treats the world like a giant chessboard, a map is merely a piece of paper waiting to be torn apart and rewritten by the tip of a sword. The Old World was a collection of dusty titles, ancient borders, and stagnant dynasties that believed their right to rule was carved in stone by the heavens themselves. But in the wake of Austerlitz, the Emperor of the French proved that the only true geography is the one defined by the reach of his cannons and the absolute weight of his will. The lines that had stood for 1,000 years were erased in an instant, replaced by a new geometry of power that turned an entire continent into a single, breathing monument to the ambition of a boy from Ajaccio. The victory at Austerlitz had not just shattered an army, it had shattered the very foundation of the old European order. Napoleon looked at the shattered remains of the Holy Roman Empire and saw not a ruin to be pitied, but a construction site for a grander design. He forced Francis II to abdicate the ancient crown of the Caesars, bringing an end to a political structure that had existed since the time of Charlemagne. In its place, he constructed the Confederation of the Rhine, a buffer state of German principalities that owed their survival and their loyalty solely to him. He was no longer just the master of France. He was the master of Germany, the arbiter of Italy, and the protector of a dozen client states that danced to the rhythm of his commands. The kings of the Old World watched in frozen terror as their borders dissolved, and their ancient rights were swept away by the administrative precision of a man who viewed sovereignty as a matter of tactical efficiency. But the hunger for dominance was a fire that required constant fuel. When Prussia, the proud military kingdom of Frederick the Great, dared to challenge the new order in 1806, Napoleon did not just defeat them. He dismantled them in a campaign of terrifying speed and brutality. At the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, the legendary Prussian army was turned into a fleeing mob in a single day. Napoleon marched through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin as a conqueror, standing before the tomb of the great Frederick in a moment of silent reflection that was more chilling than any victory speech. He realized that he was no longer just a leader of men. He was the successor to the giants of history, a man who was outrunning time itself. He took the sword of Frederick as a trophy, but his true prize was the total submission of a nation that had once considered itself invincible. The culmination of this era of total map-making occurred on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River in the summer of 1807. Here, at the village of Tilsit, the two most powerful men on earth met to decide the fate of the world. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia sat within a gilded pavilion anchored between two shores, a meeting of two different eras and two different souls. Napoleon used his formidable charm and the crushing weight of his military reputation to seduce the young Tsar into a partnership that would effectively divide the continent into two spheres of influence. To the world, it looked like a meeting of equals, but to Napoleon, it was the ultimate strategic maneuver. He had neutralized Russia and isolated his true enemy, Great Britain, behind a wall of treaties and the crushing economic pressure of his continental system. The map of the world was now a reflection of his own mind, a tapestry of states and alliances that were all connected to the singular point of his throne in Paris. To ensure the permanence of his new world, Napoleon began to treat the thrones of Europe like pieces of furniture to be distributed among his own blood. He placed his brother Joseph in Naples and later in Spain, Louis in Holland, and Jerome in Westphalia. He was building a family of kings, a dynasty of merit that replaced the old aristocracy of blood with the new aristocracy of the sword. He believed that by placing his brothers on the thrones of Europe, he could bind the continent together in a permanent union of law and loyalty. He did not see them as individuals, but as administrative outposts of his own absolute will. Yet beneath the glitter of the new crowns and the grandeur of the Tilsit treaties, a dark current of resentment was beginning to flow. The people of Europe were discovering that while Napoleon brought the laws of the modern age, he also brought the heavy hand of a foreign master. The map had been redrawn, but the earth beneath it was beginning to tremble with the first vibrations of a nationalistic fire that no amount of mathematics or geometry could fully contain. The storm was now at its absolute peak, a global hurricane of fire and law that had turned the entire world into a stage for the glory of a single name. They say that there is a point in the ascent of a mountain where the air becomes so thin and the view so vast that a man begins to believe he is no longer walking upon the earth, but among the stars themselves. The world believes that power is a steady light, but those who have held it know that at its absolute peak, It is a blinding and solitary sun that casts no shadow because it occupies the entire sky. For the Emperor of the French, the years between 1808 and 1811 were not merely a period of reign. They were a moment of suspended time where the laws of nature and the will of a single individual seemed to have merged into a solitary, unyielding force. The boy who once listened to the crashing waves of Ajaccio had become the silent pulse of a continent, a master who had turned the map of Europe into a personal mirror of his own restless soul. The imperial zenith was not defined by a single battle, but by the heavy and absolute silence of his enemies. After the treaties of Tilsit, the kings of the Old World moved like ghosts in the shadow of his throne, their crowns flickering with a dim and stolen light. In the autumn of 1808, at the Congress of Erfurt, Napoleon stood at the center of a parterre of kings, a gathering where emperors and princes vied for the privilege of a single glance from the man who had humbled them all. It was a spectacle of supreme vanity and terrifying order, a moment where the architecture of power reached its most ornate and fragile perfection. He treated the ancient dynasties of Europe like subordinate officers, moving them across the political landscape with a casual indifference that masked the cold mathematics of his grand design. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was the sun around which all the lesser planets of the world were forced to orbit. Yet, even at the height of this glory, the architect knew that a palace without an heir is merely a magnificent tomb. The tragedy of his personal life became a matter of state security. Josephine, the woman who had captured his heart in the salons of Paris and whose name he had whispered on every battlefield from Italy to Egypt, could not provide the son his empire required for its permanence. The divorce in 1809 was a moment of profound darkness that mirrored the coldness of his own logic. He chose the cold necessity of power over the warmth of human love, sacrificing his own heart to the altar of his destiny. When he married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the very Austrian emperor he had so often defeated, he believed he was finally merging his revolutionary sword with the ancient blood of the Habsburgs. He was no longer an upstart. He was a husband of tradition, attempting to bind the future of Europe through the veins of a child yet to be born. The birth of his son in 1811, the King of Rome, felt like the final piece of the equation falling into place. The empire was at its greatest extent, stretching from the sun-drenched coast of Spain to the frozen borders of Poland, comprising 130 departments and 80 million subjects. The French Lake of the Mediterranean was surrounded by a wall of laws, taxes, and administrative precision that made the old world look like a disorganized dream. Paris had become the capital of the universe, a city of marble and monuments that spoke of a new Rome that would never fall. Napoleon walked through the halls of the Tuileries Palace with the gait of a man who had conquered time itself, his every decree an echo of the absolute, and his every thought a blueprint for 1,000 years of peace. He was the master of the world, and the world was silent in his presence. But beneath the glittering surface of the imperial court and the vast expanse of the Grand Empire, a hidden current of exhaustion and resentment was beginning to gather. The Continental system, designed to starve the British Empire into submission, was instead beginning to choke the economies of his own allies. The war in Spain had become a bleeding ulcer that drained his finest troops into the dust of the peninsula, a conflict that no amount of mathematical precision could seem to solve. The Tsar in St. Petersburg was beginning to drift away from the partnership of Tilsit, his silence a growing thunderclap on the eastern horizon. The zenith was a beautiful and terrifying plateau, but it was also a place where there was no longer any room to climb. To stay still was to begin to fall, and the emperor knew that a throne built on movement must eventually face the friction of reality. The storm was not over. It had merely become the atmosphere itself, a heavy and static pressure that was waiting for the slightest shift in the wind to turn back into a hurricane. The boy from Ajaccio had reached the stars, but he was discovering that the higher a man rises, the more the earth begins to pull at his heels with a jealous and relentless gravity. The pinnacle had been reached, and as the sun of 1811 began to set, the first shadows of a coming winter were already lengthening across the marble floors of his global monument. They say that a crown is not a piece of jewelry, but a circle of fire that slowly consumes the forehead of the one who wears it. The world believes that the summit of power is a place of rest and panoramic clarity, but for the man who ruled from the Atlantic to the Vistula, it was a chamber of endless echoes and growing shadows. By the year 1812, the Emperor of the French had become a prisoner of his own success, trapped within a monumental structure of law and conquest that required every waking second of his life to remain standing. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had built a world in his own image, but he was discovering that the weight of a world is more than any mortal spirit can carry without beginning to crack. Napoleon was no longer the thin, hungry captain who had charged across the bridge at Lodi. He was a man of 42, his body thickening and his face becoming a mask of imperial marble. He spent his nights in the dimly lit offices of the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by mountains of paperwork and maps that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. He was the chief clerk of Europe, personally reviewing tax ledgers from Naples, police reports from Hamburg, and troop movements from the borders of Poland. This was the invisible burden of absolute power, the realization that the machine he had created was so complex that only his mind could hold it together. He was exhausted, yet he could not sleep, for the silence of the night was filled with the scratching of his own quill and the distant thunder of a continent that was beginning to groan under the pressure of his demands. The Spanish ulcer was the first deep wound in the myth of his invincibility. In the sun-scorched mountains of the peninsula, his finest marshals were being humbled not by great armies, but by an invisible enemy of peasants and priests who fought with a primal fury that no mathematical strategy could contain. For the first time, the mathematics of war were failing him. The more troops he sent into the Spanish dust, the more the wound bled, draining the Grand Armée of its strength and its soul. He looked at the reports from Spain and saw a darkness he did not understand, a nationalistic fire that did not obey the laws of geometry or the logic of the Enlightenment. It was a reminder that the earth has a memory, and that people do not always choose the order of a master over the chaos of their own freedom. Behind the golden curtains of the imperial court, the personal life of the emperor was a landscape of cold necessity. He had his heir, the young king of Rome, a child who represented the future of the Bonaparte dynasty. Yet, the halls of the palace felt empty without the presence of Josephine. His new empress, Marie-Louise, was a dutiful consort and a link to the ancient blood of the Habsburgs, but she was a stranger in a world he had built with his own hands. He often found himself staring at the portraits of his past, remembering the raw passion of the early days when he fought for a woman's smile rather than the stability of a throne. He was surrounded by a new nobility of his own making, men who had become dukes and princes because of his favor, yet he felt more alone than he ever had in the library at Brienne. The weight of the crown was not just the responsibility of the state, it was the isolation of a man who had risen so high that there was no one left to look him in the eye. But the greatest shadow was gathering in the east. The friendship of Tilsit had turned into a cold and silent rivalry. Tsar Alexander, I was no longer the mesmerized partner of 1807. He was a monarch who had realized that Napoleon's continental system was a slow poison for the Russian economy. The letters between Paris and St. Petersburg grew shorter and colder, filled with veiled threats and the rigid language of impending conflict. Napoleon realized that his empire could not tolerate a rival, and Alexander realized that Russia could not survive as a satellite of France. The mathematics of power were now pointing toward a single, terrifying conclusion: a march into the heart of the Russian wilderness. The emperor looked at the maps of the vast plains beyond the Niemen River, calculating distances that defied human imagination. He was preparing the largest army the world had ever seen, a grand armée of 20 nations. But in his heart, he felt the first tremors of a storm that even he might not be able to direct. The weight was becoming a crushing force, and as the spring of 1812 approached, the architect of power prepared to stake everything on one final, desperate gamble against the very scale of the earth itself. The earth is a vast and silent witness to the vanity of men, but there are places where the land itself seems to rise up to defend its own ancient secrets against the intrusion of a mortal master. In the early summer of 1812, the horizon of Eastern Europe was no longer a line on a map. It was a hungry mouth waiting to swallow the greatest assembly of steel and bone the world had ever seen. They say that a man's genius is his ability to see the invisible, but for the Emperor of the French, the invisible was a shadow that had grown so large it had become the sky itself. The mathematics of war were about to face the uncalculable infinity of the Russian wilderness, a place where the logic of the bayonet would be tested by the brutal silence of the steppe and the relentless indifference of the stars. The crossing of the Niemen River on June 24th was a spectacle of supreme hubris and terrifying beauty. Napoleon stood on a small hill, watching as nearly 600,000 soldiers from 20 different nations marched across the bridges in a rhythmic pulse of blue, white, and gold. It was a grand armée of unprecedented scale, a moving city of muskets, cannons, and horses that stretched as far as the eye could see. The emperor looked at this ocean of power and believed that he had finally conquered the variable of numbers. He expected a decisive battle within weeks, a repeat of Austerlitz where he could shatter the Russian spirit and force the Tsar to return to the partnership of Tilsit. He did not see an invasion. He saw a grand geometric maneuver that would conclude with a single strike in the heart of the East. But as the last of his columns disappeared into the vast forests of Lithuania, the silence of the landscape began to feel like a trap. The Russian strategy was not a matter of military maneuvers, but an act of total surrender to the scale of their own land. Under the command of Barclay de Tolly and later the old fox Kutuzov, the Russian armies did not stand and fight. They retreated, moving deeper into the interior and burning everything they left behind. The scorched earth policy turned the fertile plains into a blackened wasteland where the French soldiers found no food, no shelter, and no enemy to strike. The heat of the Russian summer became a physical weight, turning the roads into rivers of dust that choked the horses and blinded the men. The mathematics of the supply lines began to crumble as the distances grew beyond the reach of human endurance. For every mile the Grand Armée advanced, it lost thousands of men to exhaustion, thirst, and the silent bite of typhus. The predator was chasing a ghost that left only smoke and ashes in its wake. By the time the army reached the city of Smolensk in August, the Great Shadow had begun to darken the morale of the finest troops in Europe. They had won every skirmish, yet they were losing the war. Napoleon paced his tent at night, staring at maps that seemed to expand the further he looked. He was a man of the Mediterranean who was used to the human scale of Italy and Germany, but here, the horizon was a taunt that never ended. He decided to push deeper toward Moscow, believing that the ancient capital was the heart of the empire and that its capture would surely end the nightmare. He was no longer calculating for victory. He was calculating for a conclusion to a story that was spiraling out of his control. He was walking into the heart of a frozen sun, led by a destiny that had once been his servant but was now becoming his executioner. The Russian wilderness was a mirror reflecting his own isolation, a vast and empty space where the echoes of his commands were lost in the wind. The storm was no longer rising. It was being swallowed by the silence of the north, waiting for the first flakes of snow to turn the dream of an empire into a white and endless tomb. They say that victory is the capture of the enemy's capital and the silencing of its bells. But in the autumn of 1812, the Emperor of the French found that a city of stone can be a tomb of ash and a sanctuary of ghosts. The world believes that a conqueror's path is paved with the keys to the gates he breaks down. But on the Sparrow Hills overlooking the gilded domes of Moscow, Napoleon realized that he had not captured a heart, but a hollow shell. He stood on the heights and watched the sun reflect off the crosses of the Kremlin, waiting for a delegation of boyars to bring him the submission of a nation. But the silence that greeted him was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a void that was about to be filled with the roar of an inferno. The mathematics of his ambition had led him to a place where the logic of numbers failed, for the land had decided that if it could not be free, it would simply cease to exist. The entry into Moscow on September 14th was a surreal and haunting experience that felt more like a funeral than a triumph. The Grand Armée, thinned by the bloodbath at Borodino and the grueling march through the dust, walked into a city of 300,000 people and found only the wind and the stray dogs. The houses were empty, the shops were locked, and the grand palaces of the aristocracy stood like silent sentinels of a vanished world. Napoleon took up residence in the Kremlin, the ancient fortress of the Tsars, believing that his presence in the very center of Russian power would eventually force Alexander to the negotiating table. He spent his first night in the stone chambers of the palace, surrounded by the ghosts of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, listening to the rhythmic ticking of his own clock and the distant, unsettling sounds of a city that was breathing its last. Then came the fire. It began as small, scattered flickers in the merchant districts, easily ignored as the accidents of an occupied city. But as the wind rose, the flickers turned into a coordinated wall of flame that began to consume the wooden heart of Moscow. The Russian governor, Rostopchin, had left behind a city rigged with fuses and manned by a desperate army of arsonists who preferred ash to occupation. For 4 days, the French army fought an enemy they could not shoot or bayonet. The sky over the Kremlin turned a bruised purple and orange, and the air became a choking thicket of smoke and embers. Napoleon stood on the ramparts of the fortress and watched as his greatest prize turned into a sea of fire. He was forced to flee the Kremlin through a narrow corridor of heat, his hair singed and his eyes stinging from the debris of a burning empire. He realized then that he was not fighting a war of politics or borders, but a war of extinction. For 35 days, the emperor remained in the ruins of Moscow, waiting for a message from St. Petersburg that would never come. He was a master of the chessboard who had finally reached the final square, only to find that his opponent had burned the board and walked away into the darkness. He wrote letters to Alexander that were filled with a mixture of imperial arrogance and desperate pleading. But the Tsar's only answer was the silence of the northern forests. The weather remained deceptively warm, a beautiful autumn that Napoleon believed was a gift from his destiny. He was blinded by the golden sun of the late season, failing to realize that the mathematics of the winter were already calculating the exact moment of his destruction. His troops wandered through the ruins, looting silk and silver while their horses died of hunger and their supply lines were shredded by Cossack ghosts who moved like shadows in the night. By the time the order to retreat was finally given on October 19th, the Grand Armée was no longer a military force. It was a caravan of the doomed, laden with treasures they could never carry and haunted by the memory of a city that had committed suicide to defeat them. Napoleon looked back at the smoke rising from the ruins of Moscow for the last time, his face a mask of iron determination that hid a growing and terrifying awareness. He had entered Russia as a god of war and was leaving as a survivor of a catastrophe that no one could have predicted. The fires of Moscow had illuminated the limits of his power and the terrifying reality of a world that refused to be mastered by his logic. The storm was no longer at his back. It was closing in from the cold horizon, and the mathematics of the future were now pointing toward a long and frozen road where the only rule was survival, and the only prize was the right to see the sun rise one more time. The sky over the endless plains of Russia did not turn black with the coming of the storm. It turned a blinding, sterile white that erased the horizon and swallowed the very concept of hope. They say that a man can conquer any enemy he can see, but how does one fight the air itself when it turns into 1,000 invisible needles of ice? How does an emperor command a world that has frozen into a silent and indifferent tomb? The retreat from Moscow was not a military movement. It was a descent into a primal nightmare where the mathematics of power were replaced by the brutal and elementary logic of survival. The Grand Armée, once the most glittering machine of war the world had ever seen, was now being dismantled by an enemy that did not use steel or lead, but the absolute and terrifying weight of the winter. By the beginning of November 1812, the beautiful autumn that had deceived Napoleon was gone, replaced by the first true breath of general winter. The temperature dropped with a suddenness that felt like a physical blow to the heart, plunging far below the freezing point until the iron of the muskets burned the skin, and the breath of the men turned into crystals of ice before it could leave their lips. The road back toward the west became a white graveyard. Thousands of horses, the literal engines of the army, collapsed in the snow, their strength exhausted by hunger and the lack of winter shoes. Without horses, the grand cannons, the very symbols of Napoleon's genius, were abandoned in the drifts, left behind like rusted toys in a landscape that no longer obeyed the laws of artillery. The proud cavalrymen of the guard were forced to walk in their heavy boots, their feet blackening with frostbite as they stumbled through the knee-deep powder. The silence of the Russian wilderness was broken only by the rhythmic crunch of the snow and the occasional, haunting cry of the wolves that followed the column like a shadow. But there was another predator, one that moved with even greater stealth. The Cossacks appeared out of the mist on their small, sturdy ponies, striking at the edges of the retreating army and vanishing before a single shot could be fired in return. They were the ghosts of the steppe, reclaiming their land from the frozen giants who had dared to invade it. Napoleon rode in his carriage, his face wrapped in furs and his eyes fixed on a distant point that only he could see. He was no longer calculating for victory or glory. He was calculating the rate of attrition, watching as his empire evaporated with every mile of the frozen road. He was a master of trajectories who had finally run out of space. The man who had once redrawn the map of the world was now a prisoner of a landscape that refused to be measured. The suffering of the common soldier reached a level of horror that defied description in the official bulletins of Paris. Men huddled together at night for a warmth that never came, waking up to find that the companions on either side had turned into statues of ice during the dark hours. They burned the wheels of their wagons to stay alive for a few more minutes, and they fought over the frozen meat of dead horses as if it were a banquet of the gods. The discipline that had conquered Europe dissolved into a desperate and lonely struggle for a single crust of bread or a dry place to lie down. The road of White Death was paved with the discarded treasures of Moscow, silver candlesticks, silk robes, and golden crosses, all left behind in the snow as the soldiers realized that the only true wealth was a single breath of warm air. As the army approached the banks of the Berezina River, the shadow of total annihilation loomed over them. The Russian armies were closing in from three sides, preparing to trap the emperor and his remaining troops against the dark and icy waters. Napoleon realized that he was standing on the edge of the abyss, facing a conclusion that no amount of geometric logic could prevent. He was the architect of power who was about to witness the collapse of his own monument. The storm was no longer a metaphor for war. It was a physical reality that was freezing the blood of an entire generation. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had reached the limits of the earth, and the earth was answering him with a silence that was colder than the grave. The dream of a global empire was being buried under the white shroud of the north, and the only question that remained was whether anyone would survive to tell the story of the man who had tried to master the winter. The water of a frozen river does not just kill the body, it seeks to extinguish the very memory of the soul. They say that a man's greatest triumphs are often forged in the fires of victory, but for the Emperor of the French, his most profound moment of defiance occurred in the icy embrace of the Berezina. The world believes that a trap is a fixed point of no return, but on the dark banks of a Russian river in late November 1812, Napoleon realized that the mathematics of survival required a sacrifice so great that it would silence the winds of history itself. This was not a battle of strategy or grand maneuvers. It was a struggle against a liquid grave, a final stand of a dying giant who refused to let the earth swallow him whole. By November 25th, the remnants of the Grand Armée were a collection of ghosts huddled in the ruins of their former glory. Behind them lay the smoke of Moscow and the frozen road of White Death. And before them lay the Berezina, a wide expanse of dark water filled with grinding blocks of ice that acted like a jagged saw against any hope of escape. The Russian armies were closing in from three sides, a triple ring of steel and fire that sought to trap the emperor against the river and end the Napoleonic era once and for all. The world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable surrender of the man who had once redrawn the map of the world with a single stroke of his pen. But the architect of power was not finished. In the depths of the catastrophe, he found a spark of the old lightning, a desperate and brilliant plan to deceive the Russian generals and build a bridge to eternity. The miracle of the Berezina was written in the blood and frozen limbs of the Dutch pontooniers under General Elba. While Napoleon staged a diversion to the south to lure the Russian commanders away, 400 engineers waded into the chest-deep, icy water to begin the construction of two fragile bridges. These were men who knew that their task was a death sentence. They stood for hours in the freezing current, their hammers striking against the timber while the ice shredded their skin and the cold turned their hearts into stones of lead. Almost every one of them would eventually perish from the exposure, but they did not stop. They were the silent pillars upon which the future of the empire rested, an army of martyrs who stood in the throat of death so that their emperor might live to fight another day. The crossing began on November 26th, a scene of such profound chaos and suffering that it felt as though the world itself were being torn apart. For 3 days and nights, the remnants of the army surged across the narrow planks, the elite guard moving with a grim and silent discipline, while the disorganized masses of the stragglers fought for every inch of the shivering wood. Above them, the Russian artillery began to roar, raining fire and iron down upon the bridges. The water of the Berezina turned a deep and bruised purple as the bodies of men and horses were swept away by the current. Napoleon stood on the western bank, his face a mask of iron as he watched his empire dissolve into the dark water. He was calculating the price of every second, knowing that the bridges were a temporary reprieve that could collapse at any moment under the weight of the dying. The final tragedy occurred on the morning of November 29th. As the Russian infantry reached the banks, the order was given to burn the bridges to prevent the enemy from following. A scream went up from the thousands of stragglers who were still on the eastern shore, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They were left behind to the mercy of the Russian sabers and the biting cold of the steppe, abandoned by the man they had followed to the ends of the earth. The Berezina had become a monument to the limits of human ambition, a place where the Grand Armée died so that the legend of the emperor could survive. Napoleon turned his back on the river and the smoke, moving toward the safety of the West. But he was carrying a weight that no crown could ever match. He had escaped the trap, but he had left the souls of his soldiers in the dark and frozen depths of the north. The crossing was over, but the mathematics of the future were now written in the ice, and the world was beginning to realize that even a god of war must eventually pay his debt to the earth. The silence of a frozen night is not the absence of sound. It is a physical weight that presses against the soul until the only thing audible is the frantic beat of a heart that knows its time is running thin. They say that a captain must be the last to leave a sinking ship, but for the Emperor of the French, the ship was no longer a vessel of wood and iron. It was a ghost of an army that had dissolved into the white silence of the north. The world believes that leadership is a bond that cannot be broken. But in the shadows of Smorgon in early December 1812, Napoleon realized that the mathematics of power required a betrayal so profound it would become his ultimate secret. He was no longer a general leading a charge. He was a fugitive from a destiny that had finally turned its back on him. A man who had to vanish in the dark so that the name of his empire could survive the winter. By December 5th, the remnants of the Grand Armée had reached the limits of human existence. The crossing of the Berezina had left them shattered, a collection of shivering and dying men who looked to their emperor for a miracle that he no longer possessed. Napoleon walked through the ranks for the last time, his face a mask of iron that hid the terrifying realization that his presence was no longer an inspiration, but a liability. He knew that the news of the catastrophe was already spreading toward Paris, and that his enemies in the capital were already sharpening their daggers in the dark. To stay with the army was to die in a ditch of the Polish border. To leave was to gamble his honor for the chance to rebuild his strength in the West. The architect of power made his choice with the cold and calculated precision that had defined his rise. He surrendered the command to Marshal Murat, stepped into a small, fast-moving carriage, and vanished into the blue mists of the night. The journey across Europe was a race against the very shadows of his own past. Traveling incognito under the name of Monsieur de Bourgogne, the man who had redrawn the map of the world was now a shadow moving through the lands he had once conquered. The carriage was a small and claustrophobic world of frosted glass and heavy furs, a sanctuary of silence that was a terrifying contrast to the screams of the men he had left behind in the snow. He sat in the dark, his eyes fixed on the flickering candles of the roadside inns, calculating the miles to Paris with the same mathematical intensity he had once used for his artillery trajectories. He was a ghost in his own empire, a sovereign who had become a traveler, watching through the window as the landscape of Germany and Poland blurred into a continuous tapestry of gray and cold blue. He knew that every mile he gained toward the west was a mile of distance between him and the frozen truth of the Russian disaster. The psychological weight of this flight from fate was a burden that no crown could ever match. He was carrying the 29th Bulletin, a document that would eventually tell the people of France that their sons and husbands were gone, but that His Majesty's health has never been better. It was a statement of supreme arrogance and a testament to the absolute priority of the individual over the masses. He was no longer just a man. He was the state itself, and in his mind, his own survival was the only survival that mattered for the future of the revolution. Yet, in the silence of the long nights on the road, the echoes of the Berezina must have haunted him. He was fleeing the White Death, but he was also fleeing the realization that he was no longer invincible. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had become a man who was outrunning the ghosts of his own ambition, a conqueror who was returning home not with a trophy, but with the heavy and silent awareness of a world that was beginning to crumble. When the carriage finally rattled into the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace in the middle of the night on December 18th, the world was still unaware that its master had returned. Napoleon stepped out into the damp Parisian air, his face pale and his eyes burning with the fire of 1,000 miles of frozen road. He had reached the center of his power, but the palace felt cold and hollow, like a monument to a god who had forgotten his own worshippers. He had escaped the winter and the trap of the north, but he knew that the storm was only beginning. The mathematics of the future were now a complex web of recruitment and reorganization, a desperate attempt to forge a new army from the ruins of the old. The flight from fate was over, but the war for the soul of the earth was entering its final and most terrifying chapter. The emperor was back on his throne, but the shadow of the Russian snow followed him into the light, a reminder that the earth never forgets and that even a master of order must eventually face the chaos he has left in his wake. The myth of invincibility is a fragile shield, for once it is pierced by the cold reality of defeat, it can never be truly mended. They say that a wounded predator is more dangerous than a healthy one, but in the early months of 1813, the nations of Europe realized that the giant who had stepped out of the Russian snows was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The world believes that empires are built on the strength of a single will, but as the spring of 1813 approached, the Emperor of the French discovered that the mathematics of power were being rewritten by a force he had never fully understood, the awakening spirit of the peoples. This was no longer a war of kings and cabinets playing a grand game of chess. It was a rising tide of national fury that sought to erase the very memory of the French master from the maps of the continent. When Napoleon returned to the Tuileries Palace after his secret flight from the north, he did not find a city in mourning, but a capital paralyzed by the shock of the truth. The 29th Bulletin had shattered the illusion of eternal victory, revealing that the Grand Armée was no longer a military force, but a ghost of history. Yet, the architect of power did not hesitate. He moved with a terrifying industry that surpassed even his youngest years in Italy, demanding a new army from the exhausted soil of France. He summoned the Marie-Louises, a generation of teenage boys who were called to the colors before their time, children of the revolution who were expected to fill the ranks left empty by the veterans of Moscow. It was a miracle of organization and a testament to the absolute control he still held over the machinery of the state. But even he knew that a boy with a musket is not a soldier with a soul of iron. The first sign of the coming storm appeared in the east, not in the movement of armies, but in the shifting hearts of his allies. Prussia, the kingdom he had so brutally dismantled after Jena, saw the blood on the snow and realized that the time for vengeance had finally come. In a moment of historic defiance, General York signed the Convention of Toulon, declaring neutrality without the permission of his king. This was the spark that ignited the German national spirit. Soon, the King of Prussia was forced to join the Tsar in a new coalition, calling upon his people to rise against the foreign master. The War of Liberation had begun, A conflict that was no longer about borders or treaties, but about the identity of a continent that refused to be a French province. The mathematics of order were being challenged by the chaos of 1,000 voices shouting for freedom in a dozen different languages. Napoleon marched into Germany in the spring of 1813 with a new army of 200,000 men, hoping to repeat the miracles of Austerlitz and Jena. At the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen, he proved that his tactical genius was as sharp as ever, forcing the combined Russian and Prussian forces to retreat from the field. But these were hollow victories, the triumphs of a master who no longer had the tools to finish the work. His lack of cavalry, lost in the frozen depths of Russia, meant that he could not pursue the enemy or turn a tactical retreat into a total rout. The mathematics were failing him. For every victory he won, a new army appeared on the horizon, fueled by the seemingly inexhaustible wealth of Great Britain and the rising nationalism of the German states. He was a man fighting the tide with a sword of glass, realizing that the world he had built was beginning to tilt on its axis. The turning point was not a battle, but a conversation in a palace in Dresden. In the summer of 1813, Napoleon met with Metternich, the calculating architect of Austrian diplomacy. For 9 hours, the two men locked in a struggle of wills that would decide the fate of Europe. Metternich offered peace in exchange for the dismantling of the French Empire. Napoleon responded with the pride of a man who would rather see his throne burn than surrender a single acre of his glory. "A man like me does not care about the lives of 1,000,000 men," he allegedly stated, revealing the terrifying isolation of a spirit that had become its own universe. Austria joined the coalition, and the circle of iron was finally complete. The rising of the nations was no longer a threat. It was a reality that surrounded the emperor from every side. The boy from Ajaccio had mastered the kings, but he was now facing the people, and the mathematics of the future were pointing toward a final, epic collision at a place called Leipzig, where the soul of the earth would be decided in a clash of fire and law that no single mind could truly control. They say that there is a limit to the amount of blood a single patch of earth can drink before it becomes a hollow ground of ghosts. But in the autumn of 1813, the fields around Leipzig became a vast and hungry altar where the fate of Europe was finally weighed and found wanting. The world believes that history is shaped by grand ideals and the speeches of kings. But at the Battle of the Nations, history was a matter of raw mass and the brutal mathematics of attrition. This was the largest collision of human forces the world had ever witnessed before the coming of the great wars of the 20th century, a gathering of 500,000 men from every corner of the continent, all brought together by the singular and terrifying gravity of one man's ambition. The Emperor of the French was no longer fighting for a map or a crown. He was fighting for the right to exist in a world that had finally learned how to speak the language of fire back to him. The 3 days of October 16th to 19th were a symphony of destruction that redefined the scale of human conflict. Napoleon stood at the center of a shrinking circle, surrounded by the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. For the first time, his enemies had learned his own lesson. They did not fight him in isolation. They fought him as a single, suffocating wall of iron. The mathematics of the battlefield were now turned against the master of geometry. For every French battalion that held its ground with the desperate courage of the Marie-Louises, 2 Allied columns appeared from the smoke, fueled by the seemingly inexhaustible anger of the nations he had once humbled. The air over Leipzig became a thick shroud of sulfur and lead, and the earth trembled with a rhythmic thunder that could be heard for 50 miles. A sound that signaled the end of the Napoleonic era and the beginning of a long and bloody sunset. The turning point of the struggle was not a failure of strategy, but a failure of loyalty. On the second day of the battle, the Saxon troops, who had been fighting under the French eagles, suddenly turned their cannons against their own allies and marched into the ranks of the coalition. It was a betrayal that signaled the total collapse of the Napoleonic system, a reminder that an empire built on fear and force is a structure of glass that shatters the moment the master begins to bleed. Napoleon watched through his telescope as his lines dissolved from within, realizing that the ground beneath his feet was no longer his own. He was no longer the architect of order. He was a man trapped in a burning house of his own design, watching as the very bricks he had laid were being thrown back at him by those he had once called his subjects. The retreat from Leipzig was the final act of a tragedy that had begun in the snows of Russia. As the French army attempted to withdraw across the single bridge over the Ulcer River, a catastrophic error turned a tactical retreat into a slaughter. A panicked corporal blew the bridge too early, leaving 30,000 of Napoleon's finest troops stranded on the wrong side of the water. It was a moment of profound darkness that mirrored the crossing of the Berezina, a place where the logic of the artillery officer was replaced by the chaotic screams of the abandoned. Marshal Poniatowski, the last hope of a free Poland and a man who had fought with the bravery of a lion, drowned in the dark waters of the Ulster, his death a symbol of the discarded dreams of the empire. The Battle of the Nations had ended not with a bang, but with the heavy and silent realization that the master of the world was now a master of nothing but a retreating mob. Napoleon crossed the Rhine back into France with the remnants of his army, a man who had left the glory of his empire in the mud of Germany. He had lost the East, he had lost the North, and now he had lost the center of his power. The mathematics of the future were now a simple and terrifying equation of numbers. He had 70,000 men to defend the soil of France against a coalition of 500,000 who were already crossing the borders. The architect was back in his own study, looking at the maps of his homeland not as a conqueror, but as a defender of a lost cause. The storm was no longer a global hurricane. It was a local tempest that was closing in on the heart of Paris itself. The boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio had reached the end of his geometry, and as the winter of 1813 approached, he prepared for a final, desperate campaign where the prize was no longer immortality, but the simple right to fall with his sword in his hand. They say that a candle burns brightest just before it is extinguished, and that a cornered tiger is never more dangerous than when its back is against the wall. The world believes that empires fall in a single moment of spectacular collapse, but in the early months of 1814, the Emperor of the French proved that the death of a dream can be a slow and brilliant struggle against the inevitable. On the frozen plains of Champagne and along the winding banks of the Marne, Napoleon faced a coalition of 500,000 soldiers with a ghost of an army that was thinned by death and fueled only by his own absolute will. This was no longer a war for European dominance or the crowns of distant kingdoms. It was a desperate battle for the very heart of France, a final stand where the mathematics of strategy met the cold reality of a nation that had nothing left to give but its last breath. The winter of 1814 found France invaded from every direction. The Russian and Prussian giants crossed the Rhine in the east, while the British under Wellington moved through the Pyrenees in the south. Napoleon was trapped in a tightening circle of iron, yet in this moment of supreme crisis, the old lightning of his genius flared one last time. He launched a campaign of such terrifying speed and tactical brilliance that it left the Allied commanders in a state of stunned disbelief. In what became known as the 6 Days Campaign, the Emperor defeated 4 different armies in less than a week, moving his small force across the muddy roads of his homeland with a precision that made the coalition generals believe they were facing a phantom. He was a master of the inner lines, strike after strike, proving that a mind that understands the geometry of the battlefield can still defy the crushing weight of numbers. But the Marie-Louises, the boys he had called to the colors to defend the soil, were not the veterans of Austerlitz. They fought with a tragic and raw courage, dying in the mud for a master they had only seen in portraits. Yet they could not replace the hundreds of thousands of lives he had left in the snows of Russia and the dust of Germany. Napoleon paced his small command tents at night, his eyes fixed on the maps of the French countryside he had known since his youth. He was no longer a conqueror redrawing the world. He was a defender of villages and crossroads, fighting for every inch of a land that was beginning to feel the heavy tread of foreign boots. He realized that he was winning the battles but losing the war, as the Allied masses simply moved around him, their objective no longer his army, but the city of Paris itself. The psychological weight of the defense was a burden that turned the emperor into a shadow of his former self. He saw the weariness in the eyes of his marshals, men who had grown rich and tired in his service, and who now only longed for the peace he refused to give. He was surrounded by betrayal and the silent resentment of a people who were exhausted by 20 years of constant war. The mathematics of power were now a simple and cruel calculation. No matter how many victories he achieved on the field, the enemy had more men, more money, and more time. He was a mathematician who had found the perfect solution to a problem that had no answer. The campaign of 1814 was his greatest tactical masterpiece, yet it was a work of art painted on a canvas that was already burning. As the month of March came to a close, the inevitable conclusion arrived at the gates of the capital. While Napoleon was maneuvering in the rear of the Allied armies, Paris surrendered after a brief and bloody struggle. The emperor rushed toward the city, only to be stopped at the palace of Fontainebleau by his own generals. The men he had made into princes and dukes stood before him and told him the truth he had refused to see. The army would not march on Paris, and the dream of the empire was over. He sat in the quiet rooms of Fontainebleau, looking at the abdication papers on the table, realizing that the geometry of his life had finally reached its final point. The last stand had ended not with a final charge of the guard, but with the scratching of a pen and the heavy silence of a man who had finally run out of space and time. The architect of power had lost his monument, and the boy from the rugged cliffs of Ajaccio was now a prisoner of the very world he had tried to master. The ocean is a vast and indifferent boundary, a liquid wall that can turn a conqueror into a prisoner and a monument into a memory. They say that the greatest pain for a mind that has mastered a continent is not the loss of power, but the sudden and crushing arrival of silence. In the spring of 1814, the man who had redrawn the world from the heights of the Kremlin and the halls of the Tuileries was reduced to a small rock in the Mediterranean called Elba. The world believed that the Napoleonic era had reached its final period, that the ogre of Corsica was finally caged within the waves. Yet, for the Emperor of the French, exile was not a conclusion. It was a period of suspended animation, a moment where the architect of power sat in the center of a miniature kingdom and watched the horizon with the patient and predatory eyes of an eagle waiting for the wind to change. The departure from Fontainebleau was a scene of profound and tragic majesty. On April 20th, Napoleon stood before his old guard in the courtyard of the palace to say a final farewell. These were the men who had followed him through the snows of Russia and the heat of Egypt, the iron spine of an empire that was now being dismantled by the pens of diplomats. He kissed the tricolor flag and embraced his weeping veterans, his voice steady even as the world he had built crumbled around him. It was the adieus de Fontainebleau, a moment of human emotion that momentarily pierced the marble mask of the sovereign. As he traveled south toward the coast, he faced the terrifying reality of his fall. The crowds that once cheered his name now shouted for his death, burning him in effigy as a tyrant who had bled France dry. He was forced to wear a foreign uniform to escape the fury of his own people, a final humiliation for a man who had once been the personification of the state. Arrival at Elba was a transition into a surreal and microscopic reality. The island was a small patch of granite and vineyards, a kingdom of 12,000 subjects that could be crossed on horseback in a single day. To the Allied powers in Vienna, Elba was a generous prison where the fallen giant could play at being a king without threatening the peace of Europe. But they did not understand that Napoleon could no longer exist without the act of creation. He threw himself into the administration of his tiny domain with the same terrifying intensity he had once used to rule 80 million people. He built roads, reformed the salt mines, reorganized the tiny army of his guard, and established a miniature court that hummed with the echoes of imperial etiquette. He was a master of detail who could not stop building, even when the project was a mere rock in the sea. Yet, beneath the surface of his activity, a deep and silent calculation was taking place. Napoleon sat on the cliffs of Porto Ferraio, looking toward the coast of France and listening to the whispers that arrived with every ship. He heard of the return of the Bourbons, a dynasty that had learned nothing and forgot nothing, attempting to turn back the clock to a world that the revolution had destroyed. He heard of the growing resentment of the French people, who missed the glory of the eagle as they felt the heavy hand of the old aristocracy. He realized that the coalition in Vienna was already fracturing, their unity dissolving into a squabble over the spoils of his empire. The mathematics of power were once again pointing toward a conclusion that only he could see. The French people were hungry for a leader, and the throne in Paris was a vacant seat waiting for its true occupant. The exile of the eagle was a period of profound psychological tension. He was a man who had outlived his own legend, yet he refused to accept the finality of the grave. He realized that staying on Elba was a slow death, for there were rumors that the Allies intended to move him to a more remote island in the Atlantic, where he would truly be lost to history. He decided to gamble everything on one last, impossible maneuver, a return to France with a handful of men, and a name that still had the power to make the earth tremble. He was no longer the master of a continent, but he was still the master of the moment. In the dead of night on February 26, 1815, he slipped away from the harbor of Porto Ferraio, leaving the silence of his small island behind for the thunder of a final struggle. The eagle was once again on the wing, flying toward a destiny that promised either the restoration of his glory or the absolute darkness of total collapse. They say that a ghost cannot walk the earth once the stone of the grave has been set. But in the spring of 1815, the world discovered that a name alone can be more powerful than 1,000 cannons and 12 kings. The world believes that history is a series of closed doors and final chapters, but for the Emperor of the French, the return from Elba was a moment of supreme defiance that challenged the very logic of time and fate. It was a journey that began with a handful of men and ended with the restoration of a throne, a flight of the eagle that moved from steeple to steeple across the landscape of a nation that had never truly forgotten its master. This was not a military invasion, but a psychological conquest, a triumph of the spirit over the cold mathematics of the old world order. The return was a promise made to the earth and a warning to those who believed that the revolution could be erased by the mere stroke of a pen in Vienna. The landing at Golfe on March 1st was a quiet and humble beginning for a storm that would shake the continent. Napoleon stepped onto the sand of his homeland with only 700 men, a force so small that it seemed like a suicide mission to the rest of Europe. He did not march toward the capital along the main roads where the royalist armies were strongest. Instead, he chose the rugged and narrow paths of the Alps, a route that would later be known as the Route Napoleon. He moved through the mountains with the speed of a shadow, avoiding the major cities and speaking directly to the peasants and veterans who recognized his face and the fire in his eyes. This was a journey through the heart of the people, a reclamation of a nation that was weary of the old aristocracy and hungry for the glory he represented. The scent of violets became the secret symbol of his return, a silent signal that the master of the spring was once again walking the earth. The most profound moment of the return occurred on the road near Laffrey, where the 5th Regiment of the Line was sent to stop his advance. The soldiers stood in a solid wall of iron, their muskets leveled at the man they had once called their emperor. In a spectacle of supreme courage and psychological mastery, Napoleon stepped forward alone, opening his gray overcoat to expose his chest to the muzzles of his own men. The silence of the mountain pass was so heavy that the beating of hearts was the only sound. And then, the wall of iron dissolved into a sea of tears and cheers. The soldiers did not fire. They threw down their muskets and rushed toward him, their loyalties returning like a river breaking through a dam. This was the turning point where the return became a landslide, as every regiment sent to arrest him simply joined his ranks, turning his small escort into an unstoppable army of ghosts who had come back to life. The flight of the Eagle toward Paris was a march of silence and speed that left the Bourbon king in a state of paralyzed terror. Louis XVI, the man who had been placed on the throne by the bayonets of the coalition, found that he had no roots in the soil of France. As Napoleon approached the capital, the newspapers in Paris changed their tone with every passing mile, moving from calling him a brigand to a tyrant, then to the usurper, and finally to His Imperial Majesty. It was a masterclass in the shifting nature of power and the absolute gravity of a legendary personality. On the night of March 20th, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace on the shoulders of his soldiers, moving through the halls that were still warm from the departure of the king. He was back on his throne without having fired a single shot, a miracle of charisma that remains unparalleled in the history of human leadership. But the 100 Days was not merely a celebration of a return. It was a frantic race against the inevitable reaction of the world. In Vienna, the Allied powers declared him an outlaw and an enemy of humanity, setting aside their differences to forge a final coalition of 1 million men to crush him once and for all. Napoleon realized that his new empire must be built on a different foundation, attempting to merge his imperial authority with the liberal ideals of the revolution to gain the support of the middle class. He called for a new constitution and a final mobilization of the nation. But the weariness of the people was a heavy anchor on his ambitions. He was a man of 45 who was fighting not just a coalition of kings, but the exhaustion of a generation. The mathematics of the future were now pointing toward a single, decisive collision on the plains of Belgium, a place called Waterloo where the flight of the eagle would face the absolute wall of fate. The spring of 1815 was a beautiful and fragile dream, a moment where the architect of power tried to rebuild his monument from the dust of his own legend, knowing that the storm was already gathering on the horizon for one last, epic struggle for the soul of the earth. They say that destiny has a peculiar sense of irony, reserved for those who try to bend the world to their will. It allows them to rise to heights that no mortal should ever reach, only to cast them down in a single afternoon, so that the fall is as spectacular as the ascent. On June 18, 1815, on a muddy field in Belgium called Waterloo, the Emperor of the French faced the final equation of his life. The world believes that battles are decided by the caliber of cannons and the courage of men, but Waterloo was a collision between a man who was fighting time itself and a coalition that represented the immovable weight of the old order. Napoleon stood on the ridge of Rossum, watching the rain-soaked ground that would become the graveyard of his empire. He was a master of artillery who was paralyzed by the mud, a genius of movement who was trapped in a static cage of his enemy's choosing. The sun that had risen over Austerlitz was now obscured by heavy, gray clouds, a physical manifestation of a fortune that had finally abandoned its favorite sun. The battle was a brutal and chaotic struggle that defied all the rules of military science. For 10 hours, the French army threw itself against the solid red wall of Wellington's infantry, a meat grinder of flesh and steel where heroism was measured in seconds of survival. Napoleon sat on his wooden chair, his face pale with illness and exhaustion, watching as his finest marshals made mistake after mistake. Ney's cavalry charges were magnificent pictures of useless bravery, waves of steel breaking against the unbreakable squares of the British. The emperor waited for the arrival of Grouchy's reinforcements like a drowning man waits for a rope. But instead, he saw the dark uniforms of the Prussians emerging from the woods on his flank. Blücher, the old marshal forwards, whom Napoleon had defeated so many times, had arrived to drive the final nail into the coffin of the empire. The mathematics were simple and devastating: 2 armies against 1, a closing vise of iron that no amount of genius could escape. The final act of the tragedy was the advance of the Imperial Guard. The Old Guard, the immortals who had never been defeated, marched up the slope in the dying light of the evening to break the center of the Allied line. It was the last desperate gamble of a man who had nothing left to lose. The world held its breath as the bearskin caps moved through the smoke, and then the unthinkable happened. Under the point-blank fire of the British muskets, the Guard recoiled. A cry went up across the battlefield that had never been heard in the history of the Grande Armée. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. It was the sound of an illusion shattering. The panic spread like a virus, turning the most disciplined army in Europe into a chaotic mob fleeing for its life. Napoleon stood amidst the wreckage of his dreams, surrounded by a dying square of his personal escort, realizing that the god of war had finally become a mortal man. The flight back to Paris was a journey through the ashes of a burned-out star. The emperor arrived in the capital not as a savior, but as a ghost bringing news of a total apocalypse. He found a government that had already turned against him, politicians who were eager to sacrifice him to appease the wrath of the approaching coalition. He abdicated for the second and final time on June 22nd, a gesture of supreme futility for a man who no longer had a throne to give. He lingered at Malmaison, the home he had shared with Josephine, surrounded by the memories of a love he had sacrificed for an ambition that had now turned to dust. He tried to escape to America, to find a new life in the New World, but the British blockade was an impenetrable wall of wood and iron. On July 15th, aboard HMS Bellerophon, the man who had ruled a continent surrendered himself to the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies. The dream was over. The Eagle was caged not on a Mediterranean island, but on a desolate rock in the South Atlantic called St. Helena, a place so remote that it felt like another planet. The Napoleonic era ended not with a bang, but with the slow and agonizing silence of a long exile. Yet, even in defeat, the legend began to grow, separating itself from the man and becoming a story that would haunt the imagination of the world forever. The architect of power had finally met a force he could not build against, the irresistible tide of history itself. And as the sun of Waterloo set over the blood-soaked fields of Belgium, the dream of the boy from Ajaccio vanished into the eternal silence of the night.